Stop reacting. Start responding. Here's how. Introduction. The difference that changes everything. There is a distinction so simple it can be stated in 2 words, and yet so profound that understanding it deeply can genuinely transform the quality of your life. The distinction is between reacting and responding. It is a distinction that has been noted by philosophers, therapists, contemplatives, and neuroscientists across centuries and cultures. Viktor Frankl articulated it from inside a Nazi concentration camp. Stoic philosophers articulated it 2,000 years ago. Modern neuroscience has provided the precise mechanistic account of why it is true. And every person who has genuinely developed this capacity reports the same thing: everything changes. A reaction is automatic. It is driven. It happens before you have had a chance to think. Something occurs, and before any conscious deliberation has taken place, you are already doing something, saying something, shutting down, attacking, fleeing, freezing. The reaction is not the result of a choice. It is the result of a pattern, a deeply grooved neural pathway that runs from stimulus to behavior with terrifying speed and efficiency, bypassing the parts of your brain that are capable of judgment, wisdom, and values-aligned decision-making. You did not decide to react. You were run by your programming. A response is deliberate. It comes from a pause, even a very brief one, in which the part of you that is capable of reflection has had a chance to engage. A response can be strong. It can be firm. It can express disagreement, set a limit, address a conflict directly, deliver difficult news, hold a position under pressure. A response is not the same as a weak, passive, doormat behavior. Responding is not surrendering. A response can be more powerful, more effective, and more genuinely impactful than any reaction, precisely because it is chosen. The crucial difference is that it comes from choice. It comes from the person you actually are and the values you actually hold, rather than from the automatic programming of your triggered nervous system. The gap between reacting and responding is where your entire life happens. In the space between stimulus and response is the place where you either become who you want to be or you replay who your history has programmed you to be. In the gap is where relationships are saved or damaged, where leadership either inspires or alienates, where self-respect either grows or erodes, where children are shaped by the best or the worst of you, where the quality of your inner life is determined. Everything that matters most is determined in that gap. This is why the capacity to pause, to create even a fraction of a second of space between the trigger and the behavior, is perhaps the single most valuable psychological skill available to a human being. It is not glamorous. It does not look impressive from the outside. The pause is not a dramatic gesture, but it is the hinge on which the quality of a life turns. Every skill in this book, every practice, every framework, every technique is ultimately in service of building, deepening, and extending that pause. The real cost of reactive living. Before we explore how to develop the capacity for response, it is worth sitting fully and honestly with the cost of living reactively. Because for many people, the cost is enormous, and yet because it is so familiar, so habitual, so much a part of life as it has always been lived, it is easy to normalize. To say, "This is just how I am. This is just how my family is. This is just how things go when emotions run high. This is the best I can do." Automatic reactions cost people their marriages. The accumulation of reactive episodes, the words said in anger, the withdrawals that last too long, the patterns of escalation that erode trust over years, creates a relationship environment that gradually becomes unsafe. Partners stop being honest. Intimacy retreats. The relationship becomes a place to manage rather than a place to be genuinely known. And eventually, for many couples, the accumulated damage becomes insurmountable. Reactions cost people their relationships with their children. Children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional climate of their home. A parent who is chronically reactive creates a home that feels unpredictable and emotionally unsafe. Children learn to read the parent's mood before they walk in the door. They learn to tiptoe. They learn to hide parts of themselves that might trigger the parent's reactivity. And they internalize the reactive patterns they witness, carrying them into their own adult relationships. Reactions cost people their careers. The professional who loses composure under pressure, who responds to criticism with defensiveness, who escalates in conflict with colleagues or clients, this person is seen as a liability. However technically skilled they may be, they are not trusted with the situations that matter most. The leadership opportunities go to the people who can remain clear and calm when the pressure is highest. Reactions cost people their health. The physiological reality of chronic reactivity is damaging in ways that are now extremely well documented. Chronic activation of the stress response, maintained by a reactive nervous system, elevates cortisol and adrenaline, produces systemic inflammation, suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep and digestion, raises blood pressure and increases cardiovascular risk, and accelerates cellular aging. You are not just living less well. You are dying faster, and reactions cost people their relationship with themselves. Even when you rationalize a reaction after the fact, some part of you knows that you did not choose it. Some part of you knows that it ran you rather than you running it. And that knowledge, accumulated over years of reactive episodes, produces a subtle but real erosion of self-respect. You do not fully trust yourself. You do not fully believe that you can handle difficult situations well. And the absence of that trust is itself a source of suffering. The promise of the responding life. The promise of developing the capacity for response is equally real and equally significant. When you can respond rather than react, everything changes. Not all at once, not perfectly, but genuinely and lastingly. Your relationships change in ways that are immediately visible to everyone involved. Conflicts that used to escalate into serious damage can be navigated with clarity and care. Conversations that used to spiral into destructive patterns can be steered toward genuine understanding. The emotional safety of your most important relationships increases, which means that genuine intimacy becomes possible. People can be honest with you. They can share their real experience without fearing your reaction. And you can receive that honesty as the gift it is rather than the threat your reactive brain made it. Your professional life changes. You become the person others look to in difficult situations, because they sense that you can be trusted not to make a bad situation worse. You stop losing your composure under pressure in ways that undermine your credibility. You become capable of the kinds of conversations that most people avoid because they do not trust themselves to have them well. The difficult feedback, the genuine disagreement, the honest assessment of a failing project, the necessary conflict. These conversations become available to you because you are no longer afraid of what your reaction might do to them. Your health changes. As your nervous system's baseline activation level decreases, the physiological costs of chronic reactivity diminish. You sleep better. Your digestion improves. Your immune system becomes stronger. Your energy, which was previously consumed by the perpetual vigilance of a reactive nervous system, becomes available for the things that matter. And your relationship with yourself changes in ways that are perhaps the most profound of all. You start to feel like you are actually in charge of yourself. You start to trust yourself in difficult situations. The erosion of self-respect that comes from years of being run by your reactions begins to reverse. You begin to experience yourself as someone who can choose, who can act from values, who can be the person they want to be even when it is hard. And that experience of genuine agency over your own behavior is one of the deepest sources of well-being available to a human being. The structure of this book. This book is organized into 10 chapters, each of which addresses a specific and essential dimension of the journey from reacting to responding. The architecture is deliberate and cumulative. Each chapter builds on the understanding established in the chapters before it. Chapters 1 and 2 address the foundation of understanding. Chapter 1 examines the neuroscience of why you react, the specific brain systems, mechanisms, and evolutionary history that make automatic reactions not just understandable but inevitable without specific skill development. Chapter 2 examines the structure of a reaction itself, tracing the sequence of stages from trigger to aftermath, and identifying the multiple intervention points where the pause can be accessed. Chapter 3 is the personal mapping chapter, the chapter where you apply the general understanding of the first 2 chapters to your own specific patterns. This is among the most important chapters in the book, because self-knowledge is the prerequisite for everything that follows. Chapter 4 addresses the pause directly, what it is, how it works physiologically and neurologically, and the specific practices that build it as a reliable, sustainable capacity. Chapter 5 addresses emotional literacy, the capacity to identify, name, and understand your emotional states with sufficient precision to actually know what you are responding to. Without this capacity, even the pause is limited in what it can produce. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 address the three most important contexts in which responding rather than reacting matters: intimate relationships, professional life, and the relationship with yourself. Chapter 9 addresses what to do after a reactive episode, the recovery sequence, the repair work, and the learning extraction that converts a painful experience into genuine progress. Chapter 10 addresses the long game, what it takes to build the changes described throughout this book into permanent, sustainable, identity-level shifts rather than temporary behavioral improvements. The epilogue offers a vision of where this journey leads: not a perfect, invulnerable, always responding person, but a genuinely fuller human being who can meet the full range of life's challenges with more of themselves available. Chapter 1. Why You React, the Neuroscience of the Automatic Brain. To change a pattern, you must first understand it. And to understand your reactive patterns, why they exist, why they are so powerful, why they so consistently override your best intentions, you need to understand something about the architecture of your brain. Not in an abstract, academic way, but in a direct, applied way that illuminates your specific experience of losing yourself in a moment of triggered reactivity. The neuroscience of reaction is not just intellectually interesting. It is genuinely liberating. When you understand why you react the way you do, when you understand the mechanisms and the evolutionary logic and the personal history that shaped them, you can stop interpreting your reactions as character flaws and start seeing them as patterns that can be understood and changed. The reaction is not proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It is proof that your brain is doing exactly what brains are designed to do under conditions of perceived threat. Understanding this does not excuse the reaction or its consequences, but it removes the layer of shame that makes genuine change so much harder. The architecture of the responding and reacting brain. The human brain is not a single unified system. It is more accurately understood as several systems that evolved at different times and that serve different functions, layered on top of each other in a structure that reflects the history of their development. For our purposes, understanding why you react, three broad functional systems are most important. The brain stem and related structures handle the most basic survival functions: breathing, heart rate, sleep, and wakefulness. These structures operate entirely outside of conscious awareness. You do not decide to breathe or maintain your heartbeat. The brain stem manages these functions automatically, and they continue even when you are unconscious. These structures are not directly relevant to the psychology of reaction. The limbic system, a set of structures including the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and several others, is the emotional brain. It processes emotional experience, assigns emotional meaning to events and memories, detects threat, and initiates the physiological stress response. The limbic system operates quickly, much faster than conscious thought, and it communicates directly with the body through the autonomic nervous system. When you snap, shut down, freeze, or explode, your limbic system is running the show. This is the system of reaction. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventromedial and dorsolateral regions, is the thinking brain. It is responsible for planning, complex reasoning, perspective-taking, impulse control, moral judgment, and values-based decision-making. The prefrontal cortex operates much more slowly than the limbic system, because it requires deliberate, sequential processing rather than rapid pattern matching. It is the system of response. When you pause, reflect, consider your values, and choose deliberately, the prefrontal cortex is engaged. The fundamental problem at the heart of reactive behavior is that these two systems are not equal partners when it comes to determining your behavior under pressure. Under certain conditions, the limbic system dramatically overwhelms the prefrontal cortex. In those conditions, you lose access to your most sophisticated cognitive capacities precisely when you need them most. The part of you that is capable of wise, values-aligned response goes offline, and the part of you that is capable only of automatic, threat-driven reaction takes over. The amygdala, your brain's smoke alarm. At the center of the limbic system's role in reaction is the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure located deep in the brain's temporal lobe. The amygdala is your primary threat detection system. Its function is to scan the environment continuously for signals of potential danger and to initiate an immediate defensive response when such signals are detected. The amygdala is extraordinarily fast. Research by the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, among the foremost experts on the amygdala, has demonstrated that this structure can detect and begin responding to a threat stimulus in approximately 12 milliseconds. This is before the stimulus has even reached the cortex for conscious processing. By the time you are consciously aware of what you are reacting to, the amygdala has already initiated the stress response, your heart rate has already begun to increase, your muscles have already begun to tense, and your body is already preparing for defensive action. This extraordinary speed is not a design flaw. It is the most important feature of the threat detection system from an evolutionary perspective. In the environment in which our brains evolved, threats were physical, predators, enemies, dangerous terrain. In that environment, the ability to respond before you had consciously registered the threat was potentially the difference between life and death. The few milliseconds of processing time that conscious deliberation requires could be the difference between escaping a predator and becoming its meal. The amygdala's speed is what kept our ancestors alive. The critical problem for modern human beings is that we no longer live primarily in environments where the threats are physical. The threats we face in contemporary life are overwhelmingly social and psychological. The critical comment from a colleague, the disapproving look from a parent, the sense of being dismissed or disrespected in a conversation, the conflict with a partner, the difficult performance review, the feeling of being excluded from a group. And the amygdala, which evolved to handle physical threats, treats these social and psychological threats with exactly the same urgency as it would treat a predator. It fires the same alarm. It triggers the same physiological cascade. It tells your nervous system, danger is present, respond now. This is why emotional reactions feel so physically urgent and overwhelming. When your amygdala is triggered, your heart rate surges. Your blood pressure rises. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, are released into your bloodstream. Digestion slows. Blood is redirected from your gut and your prefrontal cortex to the large muscles that would be needed for physical combat or flight. Your body is physiologically preparing for a physical confrontation with a threat that is actually a tone of voice, or a particular word, or an expression on someone's face. The nervous system does not make this distinction. It simply responds to the signal of threat with the response that signal has always warranted throughout evolutionary history. The amygdala hijack. When the alarm overwhelms the system. When the amygdala's threat response is sufficiently intense, something specific and well documented happens in the brain. The amygdala essentially overwhelms the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. The psychologist Daniel Goleman, in his groundbreaking book Emotional Intelligence, coined the term amygdala hijack for this phenomenon, and subsequent neuroscientific research has confirmed and elaborated the mechanisms he was describing. In an amygdala hijack, the prefrontal cortex's access to its own sophisticated functions is dramatically reduced. The stress hormones triggered by the amygdala, particularly norepinephrine, have a direct effect on prefrontal cortex functioning. They alter the balance of neurotransmitter activity in ways that reduce the prefrontal cortex's capacity for complex reasoning, flexible thinking, and impulse control. The part of the brain that is responsible for choosing your response wisely is functionally impaired at exactly the moment when you most need it to function. This explains the most common and most mystifying feature of reactive episodes, that they seem to happen to you rather than being chosen by you. During an intense amygdala hijack, you are operating from the most primitive and most automatic parts of your emotional brain. Your behavior is driven entirely by the patterns your brain has developed through years of experience, not by conscious deliberation. This is why, in the aftermath of a significant reactive episode, people often describe feeling that they were watching themselves from outside, or that they cannot quite believe what they said, or that it felt like someone else was speaking. In a very real neurological sense, someone else was. The reactive pattern was running. The physiological markers of an amygdala hijack are specific enough to be recognizable once you know what to look for. Heart rate increases rapidly, often above 100 beats per minute within seconds of the trigger. Breathing becomes shallow, accelerated, and moved into the chest rather than the abdomen. Muscles tense throughout the body, most noticeably in the shoulders, jaw, and chest. Visual attention narrows to the perceived threat. Language processing deteriorates. You cannot access the nuanced, precise vocabulary that clear communication requires. Thinking becomes rigid and binary rather than flexible and contextual. And you lose access to the empathic capacity that would allow you to see the situation from another person's perspective. Learning to recognize these physiological markers, developing the body awareness to notice when your amygdala has been triggered, is one of the most important early skills in the entire project of moving from reacting to responding. Because you cannot intervene in a process you cannot detect. The physiological awareness is what allows you to catch the reaction early in its sequence, before it has fully accelerated to the point where intervention is very difficult. How your personal history programs your reactions. The amygdala does not trigger in a vacuum, and it does not trigger randomly. It triggers based on what it has learned is dangerous, and what it has learned is based entirely on your personal history. This is one of the most important principles in this entire book. Your reactive patterns are autobiographical. They are the crystallization of everything your nervous system has encountered and had to survive over the course of your life. The amygdala learns through a process called emotional learning or fear conditioning. When an experience is sufficiently emotionally intense, the amygdala encodes the features of that experience as signals of potential danger. Subsequently, when your environment contains features that match those encoded signals, the amygdala fires and initiates the threat response. This is not a rational, conscious process. It is automatic and largely outside of your awareness. A child who grew up in a family where conflict was explosive and unpredictable develops a nervous system that is hypersensitive to any signals of brewing conflict. Their amygdala has been trained, through repeated exposure to genuine threat in the context of conflict, to detect the earliest possible warning signs of escalation: a raised voice, a particular sharpness of tone, a specific look, a certain kind of silence. As an adult, this person may find that they react strongly to situations that seem mild or benign to others, because their amygdala is not evaluating the actual level of threat in the present situation. It is pattern matching against their history, and the pattern has been trained to err dramatically on the side of early alarm. A person who experienced significant criticism or humiliation in childhood, perhaps from a critical parent, perhaps through public embarrassment, perhaps through bullying, develops an amygdala that is particularly sensitive to anything that resembles criticism or dismissal. Their threat detection system has been tuned, through experience, to that specific frequency. As an adult, a mild workplace comment that a colleague with a different history might barely register can feel, to them, like a genuine attack. Not because they are oversensitive or immature, but because their nervous system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, detecting the pattern of criticism at the earliest possible signal. This is fundamental to understanding your reactions without blaming yourself for them. Your reactions are not about the present situation. They are about the match between the present situation and your history. You are not reacting to what is actually happening right now, as it actually is. You are reacting to what your nervous system has learned to expect when situations feel like this one feels. The learning happened long ago, in contexts that had nothing to do with your current life, and the patterns were adaptive responses to the genuine challenges of those earlier environments. The problem is not that the patterns exist. The problem is that they have not updated to reflect the very different environment you are now in. The role of the hippocampus in context and memory. The hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure adjacent to the amygdala in the limbic system, plays a crucial role in the triggering of reactive patterns. The hippocampus is the brain's context processor. It encodes the contextual details of experiences, the location, the time, the people involved, the sequence of events, and it provides this contextual information to the amygdala, which uses it to determine the level of threat indicated by a current situation. Under normal, non-stressed conditions, the hippocampus helps the amygdala calibrate its response appropriately to the current context. It tells the amygdala, this situation resembles the dangerous situation from your past, but the context is different. This is your adult workplace, not the childhood home where criticism was genuinely dangerous. The amygdala receives this contextual information and moderates its response accordingly. But under conditions of high stress, or when the current situation closely resembles a past traumatic experience, the hippocampus's contextualizing function can be overwhelmed. The amygdala fires based on the pattern match alone, without adequate contextual modulation. The result is a response that is appropriate to the past situation but disproportionate to the present one. You are reacting as though you were in the original dangerous environment, even though you are not. This is the mechanism underlying what is sometimes called emotional flooding or being triggered in the deepest sense. The current situation has activated a neural pattern that is so strongly encoded from past experience that the contextual information of the present is not sufficient to moderate the amygdala's response. You are flooded with the emotional intensity of the past experience in the present context. Neuroplasticity. The brain can change, and change is possible. Having traced the neuroscience of why reactions happen, it is essential to address the most important fact in this chapter. The neural pathways that produce your automatic reactions are not fixed. They can change. The brain is plastic throughout life, meaning it reorganizes itself, forms new connections, strengthens some pathways, and weakens others, in response to experience. This is not wishful thinking or motivational language. It is one of the most robust and extensively replicated findings in modern neuroscience. The field of neuroplasticity has demonstrated that the brain continues to change in meaningful ways throughout adulthood in response to what you practice, what you attend to, what you repeatedly experience. Neural pathways that are consistently activated become stronger. Neural pathways that are consistently bypassed or replaced become weaker and eventually atrophy. This has direct and profound implications for the work in this book. Every time you successfully pause before reacting, every time you create a moment of space between the trigger and the behavior, however briefly, you are activating and strengthening the neural pathways of response and bypassing the neural pathways of reaction. Over thousands of such pauses, practiced consistently over months and years, the neural architecture of your brain measurably changes. The amygdala becomes less reactive. The prefrontal cortex becomes better connected to the amygdala, exerting more regulatory influence over it. The pause becomes easier to access, more automatic, and more reliable. Research on mindfulness meditation, the formal practice most directly relevant to building the pause, has provided some of the most compelling neuroplasticity evidence. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that regular meditators have structural differences in their amygdalae and prefrontal cortices compared to non-meditators, and that even 8 weeks of daily mindfulness practice produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. The amygdala becomes smaller and less reactive. The prefrontal cortex increases in gray matter density. The functional connectivity between the two regions improves. The process of change is not fast, and it is not linear. You do not change your reactive patterns in a week or a month. You change them through consistent practice over extended time. But the change is real. It is neurologically verifiable, and it compounds. Each successful pause makes the next one slightly easier. Each moment of genuine response rather than automatic reaction builds the neural infrastructure for future responses. You are, quite literally, building a different brain through your practice. This is the neuroscience of hope. You are not your history. You are not the sum of the conditioning your nervous system has accumulated. You are a brain that can change, that is changing through everything you do and attend to, and that can be deliberately directed toward the patterns of response rather than reaction if you understand the mechanisms and apply the practices consistently. 3 key neuroscientific principles to keep in mind. As you work through this book and begin applying its practices in your life, 3 neuroscientific principles will serve you well to hold in mind. The first is the principle of the window of tolerance, developed by Daniel Siegel. Every person has a range of emotional arousal within which they can function optimally. Their thinking is clear, their emotional experience is informative rather than overwhelming, and they have access to both their rational and their emotional capacities. Above this window, in a state of hyperarousal, the amygdala dominates, the prefrontal cortex is impaired, and reactions rather than responses are the result. Below this window, in a state of hypoarousal, shutdown, dissociation, and numbness are the result. The practices in this book are, in significant part, practices for widening and stabilizing your window of tolerance. The second principle is that the body is the first responder and the most reliable signal of amygdala activation. The physiological response to trigger activation, the racing heart, the muscle tension, the changed breathing, happens before conscious awareness. Learning to read your body's signals with precision means learning to detect the reaction at its very earliest stage, when intervention is most accessible. The third principle is that repetition is the mechanism of change. Your current reactive patterns are strong because they have been practiced thousands of times over many years. New patterns of response become strong through the same mechanism, repetition. Each pause, each moment of choosing response over reaction, is a repetition that builds the new pattern. Consistency over time, not intensity of effort in any single moment, is what drives lasting neural change. Chapter 2. The anatomy of a reaction, what is really happening when you snap. There is a moment, usually well after the fact, when you can look back at a reaction and see it clearly. You can trace the sequence of events with something approaching objectivity. Here was the trigger, here was the shift in my body, here was the surge of emotion, here was the story I told, here was the behavior, and here was the aftermath. But in the moment itself, the reaction feels seamless and instantaneous. It feels as though you had no choice, as though the behavior simply happened, as though you were a passive witness to your own worst moment. Understanding that a reaction has a structure, a sequence, a series of stages, is one of the most practically important insights in this book. If a reaction were truly instantaneous and monolithic, if there were genuinely no space between stimulus and behavior, then the project of responding rather than reacting would be impossible. But a reaction is not instantaneous. It is a process that unfolds over time, through identifiable stages, with multiple points at which intervention is possible. The reaction feels instantaneous because it typically happens faster than conscious awareness can track. But it is not instantaneous. It is sequential, and sequences can be interrupted. The full sequence of a reaction, 7 stages. The complete sequence of a reactive episode, from trigger to resolution, can be mapped in 7 stages. Understanding each stage in detail gives you specific knowledge about what is happening at each point in the sequence and where the pause can be most effectively inserted. The first stage is the trigger. Every reaction begins with a trigger, a stimulus that the amygdala interprets as a signal of threat. Triggers can be external, something someone says or does, a sound, a look, a situation, or internal, a thought, a memory, a physical sensation, an anticipatory image. Triggers are specific. They are stimuli that match the patterns your nervous system has encoded as dangerous or threatening based on your history. What triggers you intensely may be entirely neutral to someone with a different history, because triggers are personal. The critical feature of triggers is their speed of action. The amygdala detects the trigger and begins initiating the stress response before you have consciously identified what you were responding to. There is a period, typically very brief, between the trigger and your awareness of being triggered. During this period, the reaction is already underway. This is why simply deciding in advance not to react often fails. The reaction has already started by the time your conscious decision-making capacity is engaged. The second stage is the physiological cascade. Immediately following the amygdala's detection of the trigger, a cascade of physiological changes begins. The hypothalamus, which connects the brain to the endocrine system, signals the adrenal glands to release stress hormones. Adrenaline is released first, within seconds, producing the immediate fight-or-flight sensations, racing heart, quickened breath, tensed muscles, heightened alertness. Cortisol follows over the next minutes, sustaining the stress response and continuing to modulate brain function, including the suppression of prefrontal cortex activity. Simultaneously, the autonomic nervous system shifts from its parasympathetic mode, rest and digest, to its sympathetic mode, fight, flight, or freeze. Blood flow is redirected from the gut and the higher cortical regions to the large muscles. Digestion slows or stops. Pupils dilate. Sweat glands activate. The body is mobilizing every available resource for an immediate physical response to a threat. This physiological cascade is happening in your body right now, in a subtle background way, every time you encounter a trigger. The intensity of the cascade varies with the intensity of the perceived threat. But even mild triggers produce detectable physiological changes. And these changes, because they happen in the body before they are consciously registered, are the most reliable early warning system you have access to. Your body knows you are triggered before your mind does. The third stage is the emotional surge. As the physiological cascade proceeds, the subjective experience of emotion rises. This is the felt experience of the reaction. Anger, fear, shame, hurt, contempt, despair, or whatever emotion is characteristic of your pattern in this kind of situation. The emotional surge feels urgent and absolutely real. It carries a quality of truth, a sense that this emotion is telling you something important and undeniable about the situation. One of the most important things to understand about the emotional surge is that it is a signal, not a command. The feeling of anger is information. It is telling you that something feels wrong, that a value has been violated, that something in the situation is activating your threat detection system. But the feeling of anger is not telling you what to do about it. The action tendency that accompanies anger, the impulse to attack or defend, is not the same thing as the anger itself. The anger is real and valid. The action tendency is optional. The emotion can be felt, honored, and understood without the reactive behavior being engaged. The emotional surge is also not permanent. One of the most reliable and most underappreciated facts about emotional experience is that emotions, if not fed by continued triggering or continued distressed thinking, are temporary. The physiological components of an emotion, the hormonal changes and the autonomic activation, run their natural course in a matter of minutes when they are not sustained by continued stimulus. The 60 to 90 second rule, popularized by the neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor, describes this reality. The initial physiological surge of an emotion typically lasts about 90 seconds if it is not maintained by continued thinking about the trigger. The fourth stage is the narrative construction. Here is where reactions become particularly complex and particularly difficult to interrupt, because the thinking mind enters the picture. But it enters in a compromised state, still heavily influenced by the activated amygdala, still impaired in its prefrontal capacity. And what it produces is not clear, balanced thinking. It produces a narrative that justifies and elaborates the reaction. The narrative is the story your mind tells about what just happened, who is responsible, what it means, and what should be done. It draws heavily on your existing beliefs about the world, about the people in your life, about what you can expect, and about your own worth and deservingness. And because the amygdala has been activated, the narrative is systematically biased toward threat, toward blame, toward evidence that confirms the danger signal that the amygdala detected. This narrative feels like insight. It feels like you are finally seeing clearly, cutting through the social niceties to the real truth of the situation. It feels like genuine understanding. But it is not. It is post hoc rationalization, constructed by a mind working in the service of an already activated emotional response. The narrative is not telling you what is really happening. It is telling you what your triggered nervous system believes is happening, which is a very different thing. The fifth stage is the behavioral expression. This is the visible part of the reaction, the part that affects others and produces consequences, the sharp comment, the withdrawal, the escalation, the defensive justification, the cold silence, the explosive outburst, the passive aggression. By the time the behavioral expression occurs, the entire system is committed. The amygdala is fully activated, the prefrontal cortex is significantly impaired, the narrative has been constructed, and the action tendency of the emotion is driving toward expression. The behavioral expression is where the real cost of reactions is incurred. The physiological activation is internal and private. The narrative is internal and private. But the behavior is external and social, and it is the behavior that damages relationships, creates professional consequences, models reactive patterns for children, and produces the aftermath of regret and self-recrimination. This is why the earlier you can intercept the sequence, the better. Intercepting at the trigger or the physiological cascade stage prevents the behavioral expression entirely. Intercepting at the emotional surge stage reduces the intensity of whatever behavioral expression occurs. By the time the behavioral expression stage is fully underway, the options are much more limited. The sixth stage is the immediate aftermath. In the moments immediately following the behavioral expression, the physiological activation begins to subside somewhat. The adrenaline starts to clear. The heart rate begins to decrease. And the prefrontal cortex starts to come back online. This is often when people first become aware of the damage they may have done. The clarity that begins to return in the immediate aftermath can be painful. This immediate aftermath period is complicated by several competing dynamics. The reactive person may still have enough residual activation to continue defending their behavior. They may be in a state that is neither fully activated nor fully calm, which can produce unstable, unpredictable behavior. They may be experiencing early shame, which is uncomfortable enough to drive further defensive reaction. And the person they have reacted toward may now be activated in turn, creating a mutual activation dynamic that perpetuates the episode. The seventh stage is the extended aftermath. This is the hours and days following a significant reactive episode, when the full implications become clearer. This stage may include remorse and the desire to repair. It may include rationalization and self-justification. It may include the beginning of genuine reflection and learning. And it inevitably includes the residue that the episode leaves in the affected relationship or context, the trust slightly eroded, the safety slightly reduced, the pattern slightly reinforced. The cycle of reinforcement. How reactions perpetuate themselves. Reactive patterns are not just produced by the sequence described above. They are perpetuated by the consequences of that sequence in a self-reinforcing cycle. Understanding this cycle is essential for understanding both why reactive patterns are so persistent and how they can be genuinely changed. Here is how the cycle works. A reaction occurs. Immediately after the behavioral expression, there is often some kind of short-term relief or reward. The tension of the suppressed emotion is discharged. The sense of power in an aggressive response is briefly satisfying. The safety of withdrawal temporarily reduces the anxiety of social engagement. This short-term relief, however modest and however quickly followed by regret, is registered by the nervous system as a reward. The brain's reward circuitry does not evaluate the long-term consequences of a behavior. It registers the immediate consequence. Did this behavior produce a reward? If it did, the behavior is reinforced. The neural pathway from trigger to reactive behavior is slightly strengthened. The behavior becomes slightly more likely to occur again in similar circumstances. At the same time, the consequences of the reaction in the relationship or context typically make the situation more threatening, not less. Trust is slightly reduced. The other person is now more cautious, more defended, or more reactive. The relationship environment becomes slightly more charged, which means the next time a similar trigger occurs, the threat level is slightly higher, which means the amygdala responds more intensely, which means the reaction is more likely to be stronger. This is the cycle of reinforcement. Reactions produce short-term relief, which reinforces the reactive pattern, while also producing long-term consequences that increase the threat level and therefore the likelihood and intensity of future reactions. It is a self-reinforcing loop that, without deliberate intervention, tends to escalate over time. Understanding this cycle explains why reactive patterns often get worse over time in the absence of deliberate work, and why they can never be adequately managed by simply deciding to do better. Decisions do not interrupt the cycle. Only the specific, sustained practices that rewire the neural pathways can interrupt it. Explosion, implosion, diversion, and rationalization, the four primary styles. Before leaving the anatomy of reaction, it is worth mapping the four primary styles in which reactive patterns manifest, because your style determines what the reaction looks like, what triggers it most reliably, and what specific practices are most relevant to interrupting it. The explosion style is the most socially visible form of reaction. The exploder's activation comes outward. Raised voice, aggressive language, physical agitation, dramatic escalation. The explosion is often followed by a rapid emotional clearing. The exploder may feel better quite quickly after the outburst, but the people around them do not recover as quickly. Exploders are often perceived as volatile, unsafe, or domineering, and the relationships around them often involve a chronic, low-level fear of the next explosion that is itself damaging even in periods of relative calm. The implosion style is the inward form of reaction. The imploder's activation goes in. They become quiet, withdrawn, cold, and emotionally unavailable. They may appear calm on the outside while internally they are in a state of significant activation. They stonewall, shut down, and create emotional distance. Partners and colleagues of imploders often describe a particular kind of helplessness. They know something is wrong, they cannot get access to what it is, and the very attempt to make contact seems to drive the imploder further away. Imploders often manifest their activation in physical symptoms: tension headaches, digestive disturbance, insomnia, jaw clenching, back pain. The diversion style manages emotional activation through redirection. Work, food, alcohol, screens, exercise, shopping, sex, or any other activity that effectively redirects attention away from the uncomfortable emotional content. The diverter does not express the reaction directly and does not suppress it internally. They route it sideways into behavior that provides relief without addressing the underlying activation. This style is often the most difficult to identify as a reactive pattern, because the diversion behaviors can appear entirely reasonable or even admirable. Of course you work hard. Of course you exercise. But if the behavior is happening in systematic response to emotional triggers, and if it is preventing the genuine processing of the emotional content, it is a reactive pattern regardless of how it looks from the outside. The rationalization style is the most cognitively elaborate form of reaction. The rationalizer responds to emotional triggers with intellectual construction, an analysis of why the other person is wrong, a philosophical position about the nature of the conflict, a carefully reasoned argument for the justness of their reaction. The rationalizer's emotional activation is real and often intense, but it is expressed through argumentation and intellectual defense rather than through direct emotional expression. This style is often the most resistant to change, because the rationalizer has genuinely convinced themselves that their reaction is not a reaction at all but a reasonable, clear-eyed assessment of the situation. Pointing out that they are reacting rather than responding is likely to produce more rationalization. Most people have a primary style with elements of one or two others, and styles can shift between situations or relationship contexts. Identifying your primary style is an important piece of the self-knowledge that the next chapter will develop more fully. The window between trigger and behavior, where everything is possible. The most important thing to understand from this chapter's anatomy of reaction is that the sequence is just that, a sequence. It unfolds over time, and in the space of that unfolding, there are multiple windows where the pause can be inserted and a different sequence initiated. The earliest and most effective window is at the trigger detection stage, using the physiological signals in your body as a cue. Before you are consciously aware of being triggered, your body is already responding. Learning to read those bodily signals with sufficient sensitivity means you can detect the trigger before the full cascade has built momentum. The next window is at the physiological cascade stage, when you have detected the trigger consciously and the stress response is underway but not yet at its peak. Regulatory strategies like slow diaphragmatic breathing can directly affect the nervous system's activation level at this stage, creating physiological space that supports the pause. The next window is at the emotional surge stage, when the emotion is present and rising but the behavioral expression has not yet occurred. Naming the emotion, bringing the prefrontal cortex online to identify and label what you are feeling, is a powerful regulatory intervention at this stage. Even at the narrative construction stage, intervention is possible. Noticing the narrative that your reactive mind is constructing, and actively questioning it. Is this actually what is happening, or is this what my triggered nervous system believes is happening? Engages the critical faculties of the prefrontal cortex in a way that can slow the sequence. The pause can be inserted at any of these stages. The earlier it is inserted, the more effective it is. But even a brief, imperfect pause at a relatively late stage is vastly better than no pause at all. The pause is not an all-or-nothing proposition. It is a practice that develops gradually, that begins with catching the reaction after stage 3 or 4, and that, with sustained practice, progressively moves earlier in the sequence until it becomes an almost automatic first response to activation. Chapter 3. Your reaction triggers, mapping the full landscape of your patterns. The most sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and the anatomy of reactions is insufficient if it remains abstract and general. Change requires specificity. You need to know not just how reactions work in general, but how your reactions work specifically. What specifically triggers you? What specifically happens in your body when you are triggered? What specific emotional patterns are activated? What specific behaviors you engage in, and what specific history underlies each of these patterns? The mapping work in this chapter is the translation of general understanding into personal knowledge. This mapping is among the most important work you will do in relation to this book. It is also the most uncomfortable, because it requires looking honestly at parts of yourself that are often easier to rationalize or avoid. But the discomfort of honest self-examination is vastly preferable to the alternative, continuing to live at the mercy of patterns you cannot see clearly enough to change. Why self-knowledge is the foundation of everything. Before you can pause before a reaction, you need to recognize that you are about to react. Before you can recognize that you are about to react, you need to know what your reactions look and feel like from the inside. Before you can know what your reactions look and feel like from the inside, you need to have observed them carefully, honestly, and repeatedly. This is the logic of the mapping work. It is not self-indulgent navel-gazing. It is the practical prerequisite for change. A doctor cannot treat a disease they cannot diagnose. You cannot interrupt a pattern you cannot identify. Self-knowledge of your reactive patterns is not optional if you want to genuinely change them. It is the essential, irreplaceable foundation. Moreover, the self-knowledge developed through this mapping work does something beyond enabling intervention in specific reactive episodes. It builds what psychologists call reflective function, or mentalization, the capacity to observe your own mental states with curiosity and some degree of objectivity, to recognize that your thoughts and feelings are representations of reality rather than reality itself, and to maintain this observational capacity even under emotional pressure. This reflective capacity is itself a core component of emotional intelligence, and its development through the mapping work is one of the most valuable byproducts of this entire project. The 6 primary trigger categories. Triggers can be organized into 6 primary categories. These categories are not exhaustive, and individual triggers are always more specific than any category can capture, but understanding the categories helps you identify where your most significant reactive patterns cluster and what underlying needs or values they are protecting. The first category is relational triggers. These are triggers that arise from the felt experience of relational dynamics, feeling dismissed, ignored, or invisible, being talked over or interrupted, sensing that you are not being taken seriously or respected, feeling criticized, judged, or negatively evaluated, experiencing rejection or what feels like rejection, sensing withdrawal or emotional distance in someone you are close to, feeling that the relationship is unreciprocal or that you are giving more than you are receiving. Relational triggers are among the most potent for most people because human beings are profoundly social creatures and because the relational dynamics of our adult lives frequently echo and activate patterns established in our earliest relationships. The second category is autonomy and control triggers. These arise when your felt sense of agency, choice, or freedom is threatened. Being given instructions in a commanding or condescending tone, having your decisions questioned, second-guessed, or overridden, being micromanaged or treated as though your judgment cannot be trusted, feeling trapped, constrained, or without options, experiencing rules or demands that feel arbitrary, excessive, or disrespectful. For some people, autonomy triggers are among the most consistently activating because their experience of having had their agency denied or violated in significant earlier relationships has made their nervous system particularly vigilant about any threats to independence. The third category is competence and achievement triggers. These arise in situations that touch on your sense of capability, intelligence, or effectiveness, receiving criticism of your work or your ideas, being in situations where you feel inadequate to the demands, making mistakes, especially publicly, being corrected, particularly in front of others, feeling that your expertise or accomplishments are not recognized or valued, being treated as less capable than you are. These triggers are particularly potent in professional environments, where competence is constantly being evaluated and where failure carries material consequences. The fourth category is fairness and justice triggers. These arise when something feels unjust, inequitable, or dishonest, witnessing or experiencing what you perceive as favoritism, feeling that rules are applied inconsistently, seeing someone take credit for work that is not theirs, experiencing what feels like dishonesty or betrayal, being held to standards that others are not held to, experiencing decisions that seem to advantage others at your expense. People who have strong values around fairness and integrity tend to find these triggers among the most intense and the most righteously held, which also makes them among the most difficult to respond to rather than react to. The fifth category is identity and values triggers. These arise when something feels like an attack on who you fundamentally are or what you most deeply believe. Having your values dismissed or ridiculed, being characterized in ways that feel fundamentally inaccurate or unjust, experiencing what feels like an attack on your character rather than your behavior, being asked to act in ways that conflict with your deepest ethical commitments, feeling that your identity, in any dimension, cultural, professional, personal, is being denied or disparaged. These triggers produce some of the most intense reactions because they feel like existential threats rather than merely social ones. The sixth category is physiological state triggers. These are triggers that operate through your body's current state rather than through the content of the situation. Sleep deprivation, which dramatically lowers the threshold for all other triggers. Hunger, which has well-documented effects on emotional regulation. The portmanteau. Hangry, captures a real physiological phenomenon, physical pain or discomfort. The hormonal fluctuations that accompany the menstrual cycle, major illness, or significant stress. Alcohol or substance use, which impairs prefrontal cortex function and therefore dramatically increases reactivity. And the cumulative effect of sustained stress, which maintains the nervous system in a state of chronic activation that makes amygdala hijack much more likely. The trigger mapping exercise. With the 6 categories in mind, the trigger mapping exercise asks you to do a specific and honest inventory of your reactive patterns. This exercise is best done in writing, in a journal dedicated to this work, rather than simply in your head. Writing requires and produces more precision than thinking alone, and the written record is available for review and for tracking change over time. Begin by taking each of the 6 categories and generating a list of specific situations, interactions, or stimuli within that category that you know reliably trigger reactive responses in you. Be specific, not, "when I am criticized," but, "when my manager points out errors in my work in front of other team members." Not, "when I feel ignored," but, "when I am speaking and my partner turns to their phone without acknowledging what I said." The more specific you can be, the more useful the map. For each specific trigger you identify, then trace the typical sequence. What do you notice first in your body? Where does the tension or activation appear? What emotion arises? What is the narrative your mind typically generates? What behavior do you typically engage in? And what are the usual consequences? Then, for each significant trigger, add the historical dimension. When did you first encounter a situation like this? What in your early experience taught your nervous system that this kind of situation was threatening? Can you trace the trigger back to a specific relationship, a specific period, or a specific type of experience? This historical excavation is important and sometimes uncomfortable. It can surface memories and feelings that you have not engaged with directly in a long time. If you find that this dimension of the work brings up material that feels too large to hold on your own, that is information that you might benefit from working with a therapist rather than navigating alone. That is not weakness. That is wisdom about the kind of support the work requires. The reaction journal, your primary tool for self-knowledge. Beyond the initial mapping exercise, the reaction journal is your primary ongoing tool for developing the self-knowledge that enables change. The reaction journal is a simple practice. After any significant reactive episode, and ideally within hours of it while the details are still available to your memory, you write a structured account of what happened. A useful structure for the reaction journal entry includes the following elements. First, the context. Where were you? Who were you with? What was the general situation? Second, the trigger. As specifically as possible, what stimulus activated your amygdala? Third, the bodily experience. What did you notice in your body, and in what sequence? Fourth, the emotion. What emotion or emotions did you experience, and with what intensity? Fifth, the narrative. What story did your mind tell about what was happening? Sixth, the behavior. What did you actually do? Seventh, the consequences. What were the immediate and somewhat longer-term consequences of the behavior? Eighth, the reflection. Looking back, what would you do differently? What does this episode tell you about your patterns? The reaction journal, maintained consistently over months and years, produces a body of self-knowledge that is simply not achievable through unaided reflection. Patterns emerge from the record that are not visible in any individual episode. You begin to see that your triggers cluster in particular categories. You begin to see that your body gives you specific, consistent signals before you are consciously aware of being triggered. You begin to see that your reactive narratives follow recognizable scripts. And you begin to see, perhaps for the first time, that these patterns are patterns, not random, not inevitable, not just how things are, but identifiable, understandable, and therefore genuinely changeable. Understanding your reactive style in depth. The earlier description of the 4 primary reactive styles, explosion, implosion, diversion, and rationalization, is worth returning to here with more nuance, because your reactive style is not just a behavioral habit. It reflects specific physiological patterns, specific emotional tendencies, and specific historical origins. Understanding your style in depth gives you much more specific guidance about what practices will be most effective for you. If your primary reactive style is explosion, your pattern typically involves rapid escalation from trigger to behavioral expression. Your physiological activation is intense and rises quickly. The emotional surge is typically dominated by anger, which is experienced as righteous and motivating rather than uncomfortable. Your narrative tends toward blame and toward the identification of the other person or situation as unambiguously wrong. And your behavior tends toward aggression, whether verbal or physical, that discharges the accumulated energy of the activation. The most important interventions for this style are early detection through body awareness and rapid physiological regulation through breath and physical space. If your primary reactive style is implosion, your pattern typically involves a rapid shift from trigger to internal contraction. Rather than escalating outward, your activation drives you inward. You go quiet, you become hard to reach, you create distance. The emotional surge is often dominated by a complex of hurt, shame, and fear, which are more difficult to bear than anger and which therefore drive the withdrawal. Your narrative tends toward themes of not being safe, not being valued, or needing to protect yourself from further harm. And your behavior tends toward emotional unavailability that is experienced by others as cold, punishing, or inexplicable. The most important interventions for this style are body awareness of the distinctive signature of impulsive activation and the specific emotional literacy work of identifying the primary emotions underneath the withdrawal. If your primary reactive style is diversion, your pattern typically involves a shift from trigger to behavioral avoidance before the full emotional surge is consciously experienced. You do not feel the emotion fully, you root around it through activity. This means your emotional literacy is often underdeveloped, because you have rarely allowed yourself to stay with the emotional content long enough to identify it precisely. Your narrative is often minimizing or normalizing. There is nothing to deal with, everything is fine, I am just working or eating or drinking because I enjoy it. The most important interventions for this style are the interruption of the diversion behavior in a structured context, such as therapy or meditation practice, and the development of the capacity to stay with emotional experience without immediately acting to escape it. If your primary reactive style is rationalization, your pattern typically involves the rapid construction of an intellectual framework that justifies the reaction and makes genuine emotional contact with the experience unnecessary. Your cognitive capacity is high, but it is systematically deployed in the service of your amygdala rather than your prefrontal cortex. Your narratives are sophisticated, internally consistent, and largely impervious to external challenge, because every challenge is incorporated into the framework as further evidence for the narrative. The most important interventions for this style are specific practices that develop genuine emotional contact, body-based awareness, somatic experiencing, emotion-focused therapy, and the particular courage of being wrong. The trigger history, connecting the present to the past. The deepest and most transformative dimension of trigger mapping is the connection between your present triggers and your personal history. This is the dimension that transforms self-knowledge from interesting information into genuine compassion and genuine agency. Every significant trigger has a history. Every pattern of reactivity was adaptive at some point in your life, in some context where the threat it is responding to was real. The child of a volatile parent who becomes hyperreactive to any sign of emotional intensity in adult relationships is not being irrational. Their nervous system learned, through genuine experience, that emotional intensity was dangerous and required immediate defensive response. The adult who becomes intensely reactive to any suggestion that their work is inadequate is not being oversensitive. They may be responding to the history of a parent or teacher whose withholding of approval was devastating and whose criticism was crushing. When you can trace a trigger from the present to the past, when you can see the specific history from which the pattern emerged, two important things happen. First, you develop genuine compassion for yourself around the pattern. You stop seeing it as a character flaw or a moral failure and start seeing it as an understandable adaptation to genuinely difficult historical circumstances. This compassion is not self-excuse. It does not mean you stop taking responsibility for the consequences of your reactions. But it removes the shame that makes genuine change so much more difficult. Second, the connection to history makes it possible to distinguish between what you are actually reacting to, the historical pattern that the present situation activates, and what is actually happening in the present situation. When you can think, in the midst of a triggered state, I am reacting to the pattern of criticism I learned in childhood, not to this specific comment from this specific person, you have created the cognitive and emotional space to respond to the present rather than to the past. This distinction is one of the most powerful tools available in the entire project of responding rather than reacting. Chapter 4. The pause, the single most powerful skill you will ever learn. Everything in this book converges on this chapter. The neuroscience in Chapter 1, the anatomy of reaction in Chapter 2, the trigger mapping in Chapter 3. All of it has been preparation for the specific, practical, life-changing work of learning to pause. The pause is the hinge on which everything turns. It is the space in which reaction is converted to response. It is the skill without which no other skill in this book can be reliably exercised. And it is the practice whose consistent cultivation produces more measurable change in emotional well-being than any other single intervention available to human beings. The pause is deceptively simple. At its most essential, it is nothing more than a moment of intentional non-action, the decision to create a space between the trigger and the behavior, to not immediately do the thing your nervous system is driving you to do. That description makes it sound easy. It is not easy, particularly in the beginning, and particularly in the situations where it is most needed. But it is learnable. It becomes progressively more accessible with practice. And the life it enables is genuinely different from, and genuinely better than, the life lived without it. The physiology of the pause. Why the breath is your first tool. The most reliable and most immediately accessible tool for creating the pause is breath control. This is not a metaphor or a vague mindfulness principle. It is direct physiological leverage. The breath is the only part of the autonomic nervous system that is under direct voluntary control, and by changing how you breathe, you can directly and measurably influence the state of your nervous system. The mechanism is specific. Slow, deep breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system that counteracts the sympathetic fight or flight response. More specifically, an extended exhalation stimulates the vagus nerve, the primary communication pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system, which sends calming signals to the heart, the lungs, the gut, and the brain. A long, slow exhalation tells your whole nervous system, the danger has passed, it is safe to stand down. The specific breath pattern most effective for rapid physiological regulation in a triggered state is the 4-7-8 breath, or any variation on extended exhalation breathing. Inhale slowly through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for a brief moment. Exhale slowly through the mouth or nose for 8 counts. The exhalation should be at least twice as long as the inhalation, and it should be as slow and controlled as possible. Even 3 to 5 repetitions of this breathing pattern, taken in the first moments of detecting amygdala activation, produce measurable reductions in heart rate and physiological arousal. The effect is not dramatic in a single moment, but it is consistent and reliable. It creates the physiological space in which the prefrontal cortex can begin to re-engage. And that re-engagement is what makes deliberate response possible. It is important to have realistic expectations about what breath regulation can accomplish in the midst of high activation. If you are already in the middle of an amygdala hijack, the kind of focused, slow breathing described above may feel nearly impossible. The physiological arousal is too high, the attention too narrowed, the executive control too impaired for subtle physiological modulation. In those situations, the breath is still valuable, but it may need to be combined with the next tool, physical space. Physical space. The literal pause. When physiological activation is high enough that breath control alone is insufficient, the most effective intervention is physical distance from the trigger. This means removing yourself from the immediate situation, excusing yourself from the conversation, stepping out of the room, going for a walk, creating any form of physical separation between yourself and the activating stimulus. Physical space gives your nervous system what it needs most when the amygdala is fully hijacking, time without continued triggering. Without the continued presence of the trigger, the physiological cascade has the opportunity to run its natural course. The adrenaline begins to be metabolized. The cortisol begins to clear. Heart rate and blood pressure begin to normalize. The prefrontal cortex begins to come back online. The window of tolerance begins to reopen. The critical variable in using physical space effectively is the use of that space. If you use the time of physical separation to ruminate, to rehearse your grievances, to elaborate the reactive narrative, to have imaginary arguments, you will return to the situation more activated than you left it, not less. The time in physical separation must be used for genuine regulation, for the breathing practices above, for body awareness, for the emotional literacy work described in the next chapter, for the values check that we will describe shortly. Creating physical space requires the courage and the self-knowledge to say, in the moment, I am not in a state to respond well right now. I need to step back. For many people, particularly those for whom retreat feels like defeat or weakness, this is a significant psychological barrier. There is a cultural pressure, particularly in conflict, to stay in the room, to address the issue immediately, to not walk away. But walking away in order to return in a better state is not defeat. It is not weakness, it is wisdom, and naming it explicitly, clearly, and non-apologetically changes the quality of the pause. Not, "I'm sorry, I need to go," but, "I need a few minutes to collect myself. I'll be back in 10 and I want to continue this conversation." Breath, body, and grounding. A complete acute regulation sequence. For moments of significant triggering, a complete acute regulation sequence that combines several physiological tools is more effective than any single tool alone. The sequence runs as follows. When you detect triggering, stop. Whatever you were doing or saying, pause it. The physical stillness is itself a nervous system signal. The body is no longer in action mode. Then take 3 deep breaths with extended exhalation, as described above. Feel your feet on the floor. Notice the physical contact between your body and whatever surface you are sitting or standing on. This grounding exercise, borrowed from somatic therapy traditions, activates the sensory awareness circuits of the brain in a way that pulls attention out of the amygdala's threat detection mode and into present moment sensory experience. Then, briefly and internally, name what you are feeling. "I am feeling angry right now. There is a lot of fear here. I notice I am shutting down." The naming, as we will explore more fully in the next chapter, is itself a regulatory act. It activates the prefrontal cortex's language centers in a way that modulates amygdala activity. Then, and only then, consider your response. From the partial regulation achieved through these steps, you will have at least some access to your prefrontal cortex's capacities. You may not be fully clear, fully calm, or fully wise. But you will have more access to your values, your reasoning, and your genuine intentions than you would have had without the sequence. The values check. The heart of the pause. The physiological regulation tools described above create space in the pause. The values check is what you use that space for. The values check is a brief internal inquiry, conducted in the moment of pause, that connects you to the person you actually want to be in this situation. The values check involves a single question, asked honestly and genuinely. Given what I value most, what response would serve those values right now? Not what do I feel like doing? Not what does my reactive impulse want to do? But what would the best version of myself, the version that is most aligned with my deepest values, choose to do in this moment? This question works because it activates the prefrontal cortex's capacity for values-based reasoning. It temporarily redirects attention from the reactive emotional content to the higher-order question of what matters most. And because your values are the product of your most deliberate thinking about who you want to be and how you want to live, they provide a guide to response that is more reliable than the reactive impulse in virtually every circumstance. Common values that appear in people's responses to the values check in triggered situations: kindness, honesty, fairness, respect, courage, generosity, integrity, patience, wisdom, love. Whatever your specific values are, they are available to you in the pause if you ask for them. The asking, itself, is part of the pause's work. Cognitive tools for the pause. Working with the narrative. Beyond the physiological regulation tools and the values check, the pause creates space for specific cognitive interventions that can significantly reduce the power of the reactive narrative. These are tools for working with the thinking mind's contribution to the reaction. The first cognitive tool is narrative questioning. The reactive narrative, the story your mind has constructed about what just happened, who is to blame, what it means, feels true and obvious during the amygdala hijack. The narrative questioning practice asks you to treat this narrative as a hypothesis rather than a fact and to actively look for evidence that complicates or contradicts it. Is there another possible interpretation of what just happened? Is the other person's behavior certainly intentional, or could it have been accidental? Is this definitely about me, or might it be about something happening for them? Is the meaning I have assigned to this event the only possible meaning? The second cognitive tool is temporal perspective. Reactive narratives are often hyper-focused on the immediate situation, stripping it of the broader context of time and relationship. The temporal perspective tool asks you to place the immediate situation in a longer time frame. How significant will this moment seem 1 year from now? 5 years from now? At the end of your life? This temporal broadening does not trivialize the present moment, but it does prevent the reactive brain's tendency to treat every trigger as an existential crisis. The third cognitive tool is the othering challenge. One of the most characteristic features of the reactive narrative is the casting of the other person as deliberately, comprehensively, and essentially wrong. They meant to do this. They are exactly this kind of person. This is always how they are. The othering challenge actively works against this characterization by asking, what is one charitable interpretation of this person's behavior? What might they be trying to accomplish or protect? What might be happening for them that I am not seeing? What would I need to understand about their situation or their history to make their behavior make sense? These cognitive tools do not always succeed in fully neutralizing the reactive narrative. When activation is very high, the prefrontal cortex is too impaired to engage effectively with cognitive challenges to the narrative. But they are valuable at moderate levels of activation, and they develop through practice into cognitive habits that gradually reshape the narrative-generating patterns of the reactive brain. Building the pause through formal mindfulness practice. The acute regulation strategies and cognitive tools described above are essential, but they will only be available in the heat of a triggered moment if they are supported by a consistent formal practice that trains the underlying capacities they require. That formal practice is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation, in its most basic form, involves sitting comfortably, closing your eyes, and directing your attention to the physical sensations of breathing. The breath rises, the breath falls. You attend to the sensations of this rising and falling. When your attention wanders, as it inevitably will, you notice that it has wandered, and you gently, without self-criticism, return it to the breath. That is the fundamental practice. This simple practice directly trains the exact capacities that the pause requires. The return of attention from wandering is a micro-pause. You notice that your attention has been captured, and you deliberately redirect it. This is precisely the move that the pause requires in the triggered moment, noticing that your amygdala has captured your behavioral response and deliberately redirecting it. In meditation, you practice this move hundreds of times in a single session. Over weeks and months of daily practice, this becomes a trained capacity that transfers to the triggered moments of daily life. The neuroscientific evidence for the effectiveness of mindfulness meditation in building the pause capacity is extensive and compelling. Research consistently shows that regular meditators have more gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, smaller and less reactive amygdala, stronger functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the neural correlate of better emotional regulation, lower baseline cortisol, faster physiological recovery after triggering, and greater capacity for deliberate response to emotional activation. The recommended starting practice is 10 to 20 minutes of daily mindfulness meditation. Even this modest investment, maintained consistently, produces measurable benefits within 8 to 12 weeks. Over months and years, the benefits deepen and become more robust. The formal practice period is the training ground. The difficult moments of daily life are where the training is applied. The pause is a skill, not a decision. One final principle about the pause deserves emphasis, because without it the entire project may be misdirected. The pause is not a decision you make in the moment of triggering. At least, it is not only that. If you are waiting until you are triggered to decide to pause, you will often fail, because the very amygdala activation that makes the pause necessary is also what impairs your capacity to access the decision to pause. The pause is a skill that is built through practice outside of triggered moments, so that it is available as a trained, partially automatic response in triggered moments. The formal meditation practice builds the skill. The cognitive rehearsal of the pause in non-triggered states builds the skill. The reaction journal work that increases your self-knowledge about your triggers and your patterns builds the skill. The values clarification work that makes the values check a practiced, accessible move builds the skill. By the time you encounter a significant trigger, the pause should be something that has already been practiced thousands of times in less intense situations, so that even when the amygdala is strongly activated, some version of the pause is accessible. Not perfect, not always complete, but some version. And some version of the pause, imperfect and brief as it may be, is vastly better than no pause at all. Chapter 5. Emotional Literacy, Learning to Feel What You Are Actually Feeling. You cannot respond to what you cannot identify. This is one of the most foundational truths in the entire project of moving from reacting to responding. When you are in the midst of emotional activation, the emotional experience often presents itself as an undifferentiated mass of intensity. Something is happening, something feels urgent, something demands attention and action. But something is not a navigable experience. Without the capacity to identify specifically and precisely what you are feeling, you cannot understand what the feeling is telling you, and you therefore cannot choose a response that is genuinely appropriate to the actual situation. Emotional literacy is the capacity to identify, name, and understand your emotional states with sufficient precision that they become informative rather than merely overwhelming. It is the difference between feeling bad and knowing that you are feeling a specific combination of embarrassment and fear of judgment. It is the difference between feeling angry and knowing that what you are actually feeling is hurt that has been covered by anger as a protective response. This precision is not pedantic. It is the basis of genuine emotional intelligence, the ability to use emotional information as a guide to wise action rather than as a driver of automatic reaction. The surprising imprecision of most people's emotional experience. Research by neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, one of the leading figures in contemporary emotion science, has revealed something important and somewhat disturbing about the emotional experience of most people. It is far less precise than we typically assume. Most people draw on a surprisingly limited emotional vocabulary in describing their inner states, and this limited vocabulary reflects a correspondingly limited granularity in their actual emotional experience. Barrett's research demonstrates that people differ significantly in the degree to which they represent their emotional states in nuanced, differentiated ways. Some people, when they feel bad, experience and represent that feeling with high granularity. They notice whether they are sad or disappointed or discouraged or despairing, whether they are anxious or afraid or uncertain or overwhelmed, whether they are angry or irritated or frustrated or contemptuous. Others experience all of these as a single undifferentiated bad, or a single undifferentiated negative emotion. This difference in granularity has significant functional consequences. People with higher emotional granularity regulate their emotions more effectively. They use maladaptive coping behaviors, including aggression, alcohol use, and other destructive stress responses, significantly less often than people with lower granularity. They also report greater subjective well-being and have better mental and physical health outcomes. The precision of your emotional self-knowledge is not merely an interesting psychological characteristic. It is a health variable. The neuroscience of why naming helps. There is a specific and important neurological mechanism behind one of the most consistent findings in the emotional regulation literature, that naming your emotional state reduces its intensity. This finding has been replicated many times and is sufficiently robust to be called a scientific principle. Affect labeling, the deliberate identification and naming of your emotional experience, reduces amygdala activation. Matthew Lieberman and colleagues at UCLA demonstrated this effect in a series of neuroimaging studies. When research participants saw an image of an emotionally expressive face and were asked to choose the word that best described the expression, the amygdala activation produced by the emotional face was significantly reduced compared to a control condition in which participants simply identified the gender of the face. The act of producing a linguistic label for the emotional content was sufficient to modulate the amygdala's response. The mechanism appears to involve the engagement of the prefrontal cortex's language systems in a way that increases its regulatory influence over the amygdala. When you name what you are feeling, you are bringing online the prefrontal cortex's verbal labeling capacity, which is itself a form of conscious, deliberate processing. This engagement of the prefrontal cortex, even in a relatively limited way, is sufficient to reduce the amygdala's dominance over the processing of the emotional stimulus. The practical implication is direct. In the pause, one of the most useful and most accessible things you can do is name what you are feeling. Not to someone else, necessarily, but internally. Not just as a label, but as a genuine, honest recognition. There is anger here. There is a lot of fear in this moment. I am feeling hurt and a little ashamed. This naming is not a technique that makes the emotion go away. It is a recognition that brings the experiencing, reflecting self into contact with the emotional content, rather than being swept away by it. The emotion wheel and the development of emotional vocabulary. The practical tool most useful for developing emotional granularity is the emotion wheel, developed by psychologist Robert Plutchik. The emotion wheel is a circular diagram that organizes emotions into a structured taxonomy, with 8 primary emotions at the center and progressively more nuanced variations radiating outward through multiple rings. The 8 primary emotions in Plutchik's original model are joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. Each of these primary emotions has multiple variations that differ in intensity and quality. Anger, for example, radiates outward to include annoyance and irritation at lower intensity, anger and aggression at moderate intensity, and rage at highest intensity. Sadness includes pensiveness and melancholy at lower intensity, sadness and grief at moderate intensity, and despair at highest intensity. Fear includes apprehension and concern at lower intensity, anxiety and fear at moderate intensity, and terror at highest intensity. Additionally, Plutchik's model includes combinations of primary emotions that produce distinct complex emotions. The combination of anger and disgust produces contempt. The combination of fear and sadness produces despair. The combination of trust and fear produces submission. Understanding these combinations helps you identify complex emotional states that do not fit neatly into any single primary emotion. The practice with the emotion wheel is to use it as a reference tool in the pause, and in the reaction journal, to improve the precision of your emotional identification. When you notice that you are feeling bad, you consult the wheel and ask, which of these is closest to what I am experiencing? What variations feel more accurate? What intensity level reflects the strength of what I am feeling? Even the process of searching for a more precise label is itself a form of emotional regulation, because it engages your reflective capacity and creates a degree of distance from the raw emotional experience. Over time, with consistent use of the wheel and consistent practice with emotional labeling, your natural emotional vocabulary expands. The wheel becomes less necessary as a reference because the expanded vocabulary has been internalized. You begin to notice, in real time and with genuine precision, what you are feeling and how it is shifting. This is the development of emotional granularity, and it is among the most valuable things you can cultivate through this work. Primary and secondary emotions, the essential distinction. One of the most practically consequential dimensions of emotional literacy is the ability to distinguish between primary and secondary emotions. This distinction is at the heart of why reactive behavior is so often damaging and so often experienced as disproportionate to the actual situation. Primary emotions are the immediate, direct emotional responses to a situation. They are the feelings that arise first, before any protective or defensive emotional layer has been added. Primary emotions include hurt, sadness, fear, grief, loneliness, and shame. They are generally vulnerable emotions. They open you toward others, they make you feel exposed, they create a sense of needing care or support. Secondary emotions are the emotions that arise in response to primary emotions, typically as a form of protection against the vulnerability of the primary emotion. The most common secondary emotion, and the one most relevant to reactive behavior, is anger. Anger is a defended emotion. It closes rather than opens, it pushes others away rather than drawing them in, and it generates the energy of assertion rather than the vulnerability of need. When a primary emotion of hurt or fear is experienced as too vulnerable or too exposing, the nervous system covers it with anger, which feels less dangerous even though it produces far more damage. Consider a common scenario. A partner says something critical. The immediate primary emotion is hurt. The criticism stings, it touches an existing insecurity, it feels like confirmation of a feared inadequacy. But hurt is vulnerable. Showing hurt means showing that you care, that you are affected, that you can be wounded. So the nervous system, working at the speed of the amygdala, covers the hurt with anger. The critical partner becomes the target of a sharp counterattack. The anger feels justified, even righteous. The hurt underneath it is barely visible, even to the person experiencing it. This dynamic is so common as to be almost universal. Most interpersonal conflict involves two people expressing secondary emotional responses, usually anger, to primary emotional experiences, usually hurt or fear, while both believing that they are simply responding to the other person's behavior. Neither person is genuinely in contact with what they are actually feeling. And the reactive behavior that results, because it is a response to the secondary emotion rather than to the primary one, almost always makes the situation worse rather than better. The emotional literacy practice of identifying primary emotions is therefore not just psychologically interesting. It is a direct path to more effective, more genuine, and more connecting responses in difficult situations. When you can identify, in the pause, what the primary emotion is underneath the reactive impulse, you have found the actual truth of your experience. And responding from that truth is almost always more honest, more appropriate, and more relationship-serving than reacting from the protective cover of the secondary emotion. Interoception. Feeling your emotions in your body. Emotional literacy is not only a cognitive practice. It is equally and perhaps primarily a somatic practice, a practice of feeling your emotions in your body, where they actually live, rather than only thinking about them from a distance. This dimension of emotional literacy is called interoception, the perception of the body's internal states. Emotions are not only mental events. They are physiological events, involving specific patterns of activation in the autonomic nervous system, specific hormonal releases, specific patterns of muscle tension and release, specific changes in heart rate, breath, and gut sensation. These somatic dimensions of emotion are often experienced more clearly and more reliably than the cognitive or narrative dimensions, particularly in triggered states when the cognitive mind is impaired. Developing interoceptive awareness, the capacity to sense your body's internal states with precision, is one of the most powerful tools for both emotional literacy and emotional regulation. When you can feel, precisely and in real time, what is happening in your body in response to a trigger, you have access to emotional information at the earliest possible stage, before the amygdala hijack has fully developed and before the reactive narrative has been constructed. The specific somatic practice that develops interoceptive awareness most reliably is the body scan, a practice of moving deliberate attention systematically through the body, noticing sensations without judgment or interpretation. The body scan, practiced regularly as a formal meditation, develops the neural pathways of interoception in the same way that mindfulness practice develops the neural pathways of attentional control. Over time, interoceptive awareness becomes more natural, more automatic, and more available in the triggered moments of daily life. Emotional tolerance, the capacity to feel without fleeing. Emotional literacy requires emotional tolerance, the capacity to feel your emotions, including the most uncomfortable ones, without immediately acting to escape them. Many of the reactive behaviors described in earlier chapters are, at their most fundamental level, strategies for escaping uncomfortable emotional experiences. The explosion discharges the energy of the uncomfortable feeling. The implosion avoids the vulnerability of expressing it. The diversion routes attention away from it. The rationalization intellectualizes it into a form that feels more manageable. All of these are ways of not fully feeling the primary emotion. And as long as the primary emotion is not fully felt, it cannot be fully processed, and it will continue to drive reactive behavior from below the level of conscious awareness. The path to genuine emotional regulation runs through emotional experience, not around it. The foundational practice for developing emotional tolerance is simple but challenging. When you notice an uncomfortable emotion arising, allow it to be there. Do not fight it, suppress it, escape it, or elaborate it through the reactive narrative. Simply allow it. Feel the sensations in your body. Name the emotion. Be with it. The discovery that most people make when they genuinely attempt this practice is profoundly liberating. The emotion, when actually felt rather than fought, is more manageable than the anticipatory anxiety about feeling it suggested. The actual experience of hurt or fear or grief or shame, when allowed rather than resisted, is an experience that can be survived and that naturally completes itself when allowed to. It is the fighting of the emotion, the effort to not feel it, that typically produces the suffering that seems unbearable. This discovery does not make difficult emotions comfortable. They are still difficult, but it changes your relationship to them. Instead of experiences to be fled, they become experiences to be felt and passed through. And this change in relationship is exactly what creates the space between emotion and behavior that is the pause. Chapter 6. Responding in relationships, love, conflict, and the space between. Relationships are the arena where reactive patterns do their most significant and most lasting damage. The people who trigger us most powerfully are almost never strangers. They are the people closest to us. Our partners, our parents, our siblings, our children, our oldest and most significant friends. The intimacy that makes these relationships so deeply meaningful is the same intimacy that makes them the most potent trigger environments in our lives. The closer someone is to us, the more direct their access to our most sensitive points. The more we love someone, the more their behavior has the capacity to wound us. And the more our early relational history is activated in our current close relationships. This is not a tragedy. The vulnerability of intimacy is inseparable from its value. We cannot have the experience of being genuinely known and loved without also having the experience of being genuinely seen in our most human, most imperfect, most reactive moments. The goal is not to create relationships in which our reactive patterns are never activated. The goal is to develop the capacity to be in relationships with the full richness of our emotional experience, the hurt and the fear and the anger and the grief, without those experiences automatically driving reactive behavior that damages the connection. This chapter examines the specific dynamics of reactive and responsive behavior in intimate relationships, the escalation patterns that turn manageable conflicts into damaging ruptures, the withdrawal patterns that create emotional distance that takes far longer to close than it took to open, and the repair patterns that determine whether reactive episodes become permanent relationship damage or opportunities for deeper understanding and connection. It addresses these dynamics in the relationships that matter most: romantic partnerships, parent-child relationships, and long-term friendships. Why intimate relationships are the hardest context. Intimate relationships present unique challenges for the responding rather than reacting project, for several specific and interconnected reasons. Understanding these reasons is important because it helps to explain why the skills that are relatively accessible in other contexts often seem to disappear entirely in close relationships, and why this is not a sign of failure but of the specific nature of intimacy. The first reason is the neurobiological depth of attachment. The attachment system, the neural network developed in infancy and early childhood that governs how we seek proximity, comfort, and safety from others, is the deepest and most primitive of our relational systems. It operates below conscious awareness, it is mediated by neurochemicals including oxytocin and vasopressin, and it is exquisitely sensitive to any signals of threat to the attachment bond. In a close relationship, behaviors that would be barely registered in a more distant context can trigger intense attachment anxiety, a tone of voice, a period of emotional distance, a perception of being deprioritized, a conflict that feels like it might not resolve. The amygdala's threat detection system and the attachment system work together to make close relationships our most reactive contexts. The second reason is the depth of mutual triggering. In a long-term intimate relationship, partners develop an intimate knowledge of each other's most sensitive points. This knowledge is not usually deployed deliberately or maliciously, but because we are so familiar with each other, and because close relationships activate old attachment patterns, partners and family members are uniquely positioned to trigger each other's deepest reactive patterns. The comment that would be meaningless from a stranger is devastating from a partner, because it touches something that the partner has specific access to. The third reason is the absence of social restraints. In professional and social contexts, people maintain behavioral restraints that partially contain their reactive patterns. The fear of social consequences, the awareness of being observed by multiple people, the norms of professional conduct, these all act as external regulators that reduce the intensity of reactive behavior. But in the privacy of close relationships, these external regulators are absent. Home is where we are most fully ourselves, including the most reactive versions of ourselves. And it is a profound and painful irony of human life that the people who deserve our best most often receive our worst. The escalation dynamic. How two people hijack each other. The most characteristic and most damaging feature of reactive conflict in intimate relationships is escalation, the dynamic in which each person's reaction triggers the other person's reaction, which triggers the first person's reaction more intensely, and so on in a cycle that can reach catastrophic levels of damage remarkably quickly. Escalation is not a mystery. It is a predictable consequence of two nervous systems that are both in amygdala hijack mode simultaneously. When you react, your behavior activates your partner's threat detection system. Your partner's amygdala fires. They react. Their reaction activates your threat detection system more intensely. Your amygdala fires more intensely. You react more intensely. And so on, each escalation feeding the next, until both people are far past the point of productive communication and are operating purely from their most primitive reactive patterns. Escalation has specific physiological markers that are identifiable and that, once learned, provide early warning of its development. The voice rises in volume and sharpens in tone. Breathing becomes more rapid and shallow. Facial expression changes in specific ways. Brows lower, jaw tightens, eyes narrow. Gestures become more emphatic. Physical distance decreases or increases dramatically. The content of the conversation shifts from specific grievances to global characterizations. From, "You said something hurtful just now," to, "You always do this," and, "You never understand me." And the ability of both people to hear each other, to see each other's perspective, to remember that they care about each other, progressively decreases. The most important principle for interrupting the escalation dynamic is also the most counterintuitive. It takes only one person to change the dynamic, and you can only ever be that one person. You cannot control whether your partner escalates. You can only control whether you do. And if you can access your pause in the midst of escalation, if you can regulate your own nervous system while remaining present in the conflict, your regulated presence has a direct regulating effect on your partner's nervous system. Calm is contagious in the same way that escalation is contagious. The physiological research on co-regulation demonstrates that being in proximity to a calm, regulated person measurably reduces the physiological activation of an agitated one. The Four Horsemen. Gottman's map of destructive reactive patterns. The psychologist John Gottman, whose research on couples over more than 4 decades represents the most extensive scientific study of intimate relationships ever conducted, has identified 4 specific communicative behaviors that are particularly predictive of relationship deterioration and dissolution. He calls them the Four Horsemen, and they are worth examining in detail because they are all, in a specific sense, forms of reactive behavior that the responding framework can directly address. The first horseman is criticism. Gottman distinguishes carefully between complaint and criticism. A complaint is a specific statement of grievance about a specific behavior. You didn't do the dishes tonight, and that's frustrating to me. A criticism is an attack on the partner's character that uses the specific behavior as evidence for a global judgment. You never do the dishes. You are lazy and you don't care about this household. Criticism is reactive in the sense that it is driven not by a genuine desire to solve the specific problem but by the accumulated frustration and anger of an amygdala that has been chronically activated. It feels satisfying in the moment of expression because it discharges emotional energy. But it produces in the partner exactly the defensive reaction that makes the underlying problem worse. The second horseman is defensiveness. Defensiveness is the reactive response to criticism. Rather than genuinely hearing the underlying concern and considering whether it is valid, the defensive partner responds with counter-complaint, with self-justification, or with playing the victim. Defensiveness is driven by the amygdala's interpretation of the criticism as a threat. The prefrontal cortex, which could engage with the possibility that the criticism contains some validity, is offline. The reactive nervous system is in charge, and its strategy is defense. The third horseman is contempt. Gottman describes contempt as the most damaging of the 4 horsemen and the most reliable predictor of relationship dissolution. Contempt involves communicating a sense of moral or intellectual superiority, eye-rolling, sneering, mocking, sarcasm, name-calling. Contempt attacks not just the partner's behavior but their fundamental worth and dignity. It is the behavioral expression of a reactive state that has moved beyond anger into something more corrosive, the belief that the partner is fundamentally beneath you. The fourth horseman is stonewalling. Stonewalling is the implosive form of reactive behavior in relationships, complete withdrawal from the interaction. The stonewaller goes quiet, avoids eye contact, gives monosyllabic responses or none at all, and creates an emotional wall. Gottman's research shows that stonewalling typically occurs in men more than women, and that it is often a response to physiological flooding, the state of extreme amygdala activation in which any continued engagement in the conflict feels unbearable. The stonewaller is not choosing to punish their partner. They are in a genuine state of overwhelm from which withdrawal feels like the only survivable option. The antidotes to the 4 horsemen that Gottman has identified are all, in their specific way, forms of responding rather than reacting. The antidote to criticism is gentle startup, addressing the specific behavior with specific language about your own feeling rather than with a global attack on the partner's character. The antidote to defensiveness is taking responsibility, genuinely hearing the partner's concern and acknowledging any validity it contains. The antidote to contempt is building a culture of appreciation, actively noticing and expressing gratitude for the partner's positive qualities and actions. And the antidote to stonewalling is physiological self-soothing, taking an agreed-upon time-out to regulate before returning to the conversation. The time-out. Using physical space in relationship conflict. The time-out, mentioned as the antidote to stonewalling, deserves its own detailed treatment because it is one of the most powerful tools available for interrupting escalation in intimate relationships, and because it is so frequently misunderstood and misused. A genuine time-out is a deliberately agreed upon, specifically time-limited pause in a conflict conversation, taken for the explicit purpose of physiological regulation, with the explicit commitment to return to the conversation when both people are sufficiently regulated. It is distinguished from stonewalling by 4 specific features. It is announced, not simply enacted by withdrawal. It is time-limited, a specific return time is offered. It is agreed upon by both parties, or at least understood by both parties to be temporary and purposeful, and it is used for genuine regulation rather than for continued engagement with the reactive narrative. The announcement is crucial. Without it, the person who remains in the room has no way to distinguish the timeout from stonewalling, and will typically experience it as abandonment, which intensifies their own amygdala activation. The announcement might sound like, "I am getting too activated to be useful in this conversation right now. I need about 20 minutes to settle myself, and then I want to come back and continue talking with you." This communication does several things simultaneously. It names what is happening physiologically, it removes any ambiguity about the intention to return, it specifies a time frame that prevents the partner's abandonment anxiety from escalating, and it expresses genuine investment in the conversation rather than avoidance of it. The 20 minutes used in the timeout must be used for genuine physiological regulation, not for continued mental engagement with the reactive content of the conflict. Research by Gottman and others shows that it takes approximately 20 minutes for the physiological arousal of a significant amygdala hijack to return to baseline, provided that the person is not continuing to engage with the activating content. If you use the 20 minutes to compose the perfect argument, to review your list of grievances, or to imagine the conversation that you are going to have when you return, you will return more activated than you left. Genuine regulation during the timeout involves physical movement. If possible, walking is particularly effective for reducing physiological arousal. It involves the breathing practices described in the pause chapter. It involves body awareness and emotional labeling. And it involves the values check. Given what I value most about this relationship, what kind of partner do I want to be when I return to this conversation? Repair attempts. The most important relationship skill. Even in relationships where both partners are genuinely committed to responding rather than reacting, reactive episodes will occur. The escalation will happen sometimes. The harsh word will escape before the pause is accessed. The withdrawal will go on longer than it should. When this happens, the most important determinant of whether the episode damages the relationship or deepens it is what happens next. Whether a genuine repair attempt is made, and whether it is received. Gottman's research has identified repair attempts as one of the most important predictors of relationship longevity and satisfaction. Repair attempts are any verbal or nonverbal behavior that attempts to interrupt the negative dynamic and restore connection. A touch on the arm, a moment of shared humor that breaks the tension, a direct acknowledgement of one's own contribution to the escalation, an expression of care for the partner despite the conflict. These attempts do not have to be elaborate or eloquent. They just have to be genuine. The more important variable is not whether the repair attempt is made but whether it is received. Research shows that in distressed couples, even genuine repair attempts are often not received. The partner is still too activated, too defended, or too hurt to recognize the attempt as genuine. In stable, satisfying couples, repair attempts are made more frequently and received more consistently, even when the relationship is in genuine conflict. Developing the capacity to both make and receive repair attempts is therefore one of the most important relationship skills in this entire book. Making a repair attempt requires the willingness to step back from the reactive position, to acknowledge that the conflict is more important than winning, to take a breath and say something that moves toward the partner rather than away. Receiving a repair attempt requires the capacity to recognize the attempt as genuine even when you are still hurt, to allow yourself to be moved by it rather than continuing to defend against it. A genuine and complete repair conversation, as distinct from a brief repair attempt, involves specific elements, an honest acknowledgement of your own reactive behavior without minimizing or justifying it, an expression of accountability without excessive self-flagellation, genuine curiosity about the impact of your behavior on the other person, and a commitment, from your most genuine self, to bring more of your better self to future similar situations. This kind of repair is not common. But in the relationships where it happens consistently, the reactive episodes that would otherwise erode trust over years instead become the occasions for the deepest forms of intimacy. Parent-child relationships. The highest stakes. The stakes in the responding rather than reacting project are nowhere higher than in the relationship between parent and child. Children are in a uniquely vulnerable position with respect to their parents' reactive patterns. They cannot leave. They cannot fully defend themselves. They have no perspective on the parent's reactive episode outside of their own experience of it. And the emotional environment created by a parent's reactive patterns becomes the template from which the child constructs their understanding of relationships, safety, and their own worth. The research on the impact of parental emotional reactivity on child development is extensive and sobering. Children of chronically reactive parents show elevated cortisol levels, hyperactivated threat detection systems, insecure attachment patterns, elevated rates of anxiety and depression, more difficulty with emotional regulation, and, in a direct illustration of how patterns are transmitted across generations, more reactive behavior in their own later relationships. This is not about blame. Most reactive parents are themselves the children of reactive parents, and their reactive patterns are the direct transmission of patterns that were themselves transmitted. The chain of reactive pattern transmission through generations is one of the most compelling arguments for this work. In developing your own capacity to respond rather than react, you are not just improving your own life. You are breaking a chain that might otherwise extend into your children's lives. For parents specifically, the responding rather than reacting work has several dimensions that are particularly important. The first is the recognition that your children are watching everything. Children are masterful observers of parental emotional behavior, and they learn far more from what they observe than from what they are told. If you tell your child to handle conflict calmly and then handle conflict reactively yourself, the lesson the child receives is the reactive pattern, not the verbal instruction. The single most powerful thing a parent can model for a child is the capacity to feel strongly and choose the response deliberately. The second dimension specific to parent-child relationships is the repair conversation after reactive episodes. Many parents believe that apologizing to a child for reactive behavior undermines their authority. The research suggests precisely the opposite. Parents who can genuinely acknowledge their reactive behavior to their children, take responsibility for it, and demonstrate that repair is possible model exactly the emotional intelligence that their children most need to develop. The parent who can say, "I reacted badly earlier. That wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry," is giving their child something invaluable, a demonstration that mistakes can be owned, that relationships can be repaired, and that adults can be genuinely accountable without losing their authority. Chapter 7. Responding at Work, Authority, Pressure, and Professional Presence. The workplace is one of the most concentrated and sustained trigger environments in modern life. It combines the authority hierarchies that activate autonomy and competence triggers, the competitive dynamics that activate fairness and status triggers, the constant performance evaluation that activates fear and inadequacy responses, and the chronic interpersonal friction of spending significant time with people you did not choose and cannot easily leave. It is, in sum, a trigger-dense environment in which reactive behavior has both immediate consequences in specific interactions and cumulative consequences in professional reputation and career trajectory. At the same time, the workplace is the environment in which responding rather than reacting produces some of its most dramatic and most visible professional benefits. The person who can remain clear and calm under pressure, who can engage with conflict without escalating it, who can receive criticism without becoming defensive, who can deliver difficult messages without cruelty, who can maintain their values under organizational pressure, this person is not just psychologically healthier. They are professionally more effective. They earn more trust. They create better outcomes for the teams and organizations they are part of. And over time, they advance to the kinds of roles and responsibilities that most require and most visibly reward exactly these capacities. The specific cost of reactive behavior in professional contexts. The professional cost of reactive behavior is real, specific, and often underestimated. Let us be concrete about what it actually costs. The leader who reacts to challenge with defensiveness or aggression receives less honest information from their team. People learn, quickly and reliably, not to bring bad news to a reactive leader. They stop offering alternative perspectives. They stop raising concerns early, when they are manageable. The reactive leader thus becomes progressively more isolated in their own narrative, making decisions without access to the full information picture, while their team silently compensates for the blind spots they have learned not to point out. This information deficit is often the direct cause of strategic failures that are attributed to other factors. The professional who reacts to criticism with defensiveness or shutdown does not grow. Their errors calcify into permanent limitations. They spend energy defending their approach rather than improving it. The people around them, including managers and mentors, gradually stop investing in their development because the investment consistently fails to produce growth. The defensive professional is left behind while colleagues who can receive feedback and genuinely develop from it advance past them. The team member who reacts to interpersonal friction with aggression, passive aggression, or chronic withdrawal becomes a significant liability. They drain the team's energy with their conflict. They create the political dynamics that divert attention and resources from the actual work. They make it harder for others to bring their best. And they eventually acquire the label of difficult, a label that is extremely difficult to shed once it has been firmly attached. The professional who cannot regulate their emotions under pressure becomes unreliable in exactly the situations where reliability matters most. Organizations face crises. Clients have unreasonable demands. Projects fail. Teams lose key people. The person who becomes reactive in these inevitable difficult moments is precisely the person who cannot be trusted with the situations that matter most. The trust that is eroded by reactive behavior in high-pressure moments takes years to rebuild, if it is rebuilt at all. The neuroscience of pressure and professional performance. Understanding why professional contexts are particularly prone to triggering reactive behavior requires understanding the neuroscience of performance pressure. Performance pressure, including the awareness of being evaluated, the risk of failure, the visibility of your work to others, activates the threat detection system. Evaluation by others is processed by the amygdala as a threat in the same way that a physical danger would be processed. This amygdala activation under evaluation has direct consequences for the quality of performance. The prefrontal cortex's executive functions, including the capacity for creative problem solving, flexible thinking, nuanced communication, and effective decision-making under uncertainty, are impaired by amygdala activation. The performance that others see under pressure is therefore often significantly inferior to what the person is actually capable of in a regulated state. This phenomenon has a specific name in sports psychology: choking under pressure. It is the experience of performing worse, not better, under high-stakes conditions, as a result of the interference of the threat response with the automated performance pathways that normally enable skilled execution. And it is not limited to athletic performance. It occurs in presentations, in client meetings, in critical leadership moments, in job interviews. The more reactive your general profile, the more dramatically your performance degrades under pressure. The practical implication is direct. Developing the capacity for response rather than reaction is not just a relational skill. It is a performance skill. The professional who can remain regulated under pressure performs closer to their actual capability. Their thinking is clearer, their communication is more effective, their judgment is better, their problem solving is more creative. The pause, practiced consistently in lower stakes situations, is available in higher stakes situations to create the space in which professional capability can actually express itself. Responding to criticism in professional contexts. Professional criticism, from a manager, from a client, from a peer review, from a performance evaluation, is one of the most consistently potent triggers in the workplace. It simultaneously activates competence triggers, your work is not adequate, autonomy triggers, someone is judging you, and, depending on the context and the manner of delivery, respect triggers, you are being treated as less than fully capable. The simultaneous activation of multiple trigger categories is what makes professional criticism so reliably intense. The reactive response to professional criticism comes in several characteristic forms. The most common is defensiveness, an immediate, automatic shift into self-justification, providing reasons why the criticism is wrong, pointing out mitigating circumstances, or counter-attacking by raising problems with the critic's own work or judgment. The defensiveness is driven by the amygdala's threat interpretation of the criticism, not by a genuine assessment of whether the criticism is valid. And it is almost universally damaging to the professional relationship and to the professional's own development. A less common but equally damaging reactive response to professional criticism is complete shutdown. The person receives the critical feedback with apparent equanimity in the moment, then emotionally disconnects from both the relationship and the work. They are unable to process the criticism, unable to use it productively, and unable to maintain genuine engagement with the person who delivered it. The shutdown is driven by the imploder's pattern. The threat of the criticism produces internal collapse rather than external explosion. The responsive alternative begins with the pause. When you receive a critical comment, your first task is to regulate before responding. This might look like a brief silence while you breathe and settle. It might look like asking a clarifying question that buys time. Can you tell me more specifically what you observed? The question is genuine, not merely tactical. You are actually trying to understand the criticism more precisely, which is itself the beginning of a response rather than a reaction. From the pause, the response framework for professional criticism involves three elements. First, genuine acknowledgement of what has been said, without immediate evaluation of whether it is right or wrong. I hear what you are saying. You are concerned about the timeline of the last 3 deliverables. This acknowledgement is not agreement. It is the communication that you have genuinely received the content of the criticism. Second, honest internal assessment in the subsequent pause. Is there anything valid here? Can you see what the critic is seeing? Is there a genuine problem that their criticism is pointing toward, even if the manner of its delivery was imperfect or the specific formulation was not quite right? Third, a response that reflects genuine consideration. If there is validity, acknowledge it specifically and address what you intend to do differently. If there is not validity, decline the criticism directly but non-defensively. I understand your concern. I see it differently, and I'd like to explain my reasoning. Emotional regulation under organizational pressure. Modern organizational life includes a specific form of pressure that is worth addressing directly, the pressure of organizational demands that conflict with your values or your judgment. This might include being asked to work in ways that feel ethically compromised, to deliver results through means that feel disrespectful to your team, to prioritize metrics that conflict with what you believe actually serves the organization or its customers, or to implement decisions that you believe are genuinely wrong. These situations activate values triggers in addition to all of the other trigger categories that workplace contexts typically produce, making them among the most difficult to navigate without reactive behavior. The responsive approach to organizational value conflicts requires both the internal skills described throughout this book and a clear understanding of the specific options available in your context. Before describing the response framework, it is worth distinguishing between 3 types of organizational pressure. Unreasonable but non-ethical demands: work more hours, deliver faster, cut corners on quality. Demands that cross ethical lines that are important to you personally but are not organizational ethical violations. Approaches that feel unnecessarily harsh, strategies that feel misaligned with mission, and genuine ethical violations that the organization is requiring you to participate in. For the first type, the responsive approach involves clarity about your actual limits, honest communication of those limits without dramatic escalation, and acceptance that the organization may have expectations that do not align with what you can offer. For the second type, the responsive approach involves genuine engagement with whether your discomfort is an ethical signal worth acting on or a personal preference that can be distinguished from the organization's legitimate authority to make strategic decisions. For the third type, genuine ethical violations, the responsive approach may involve formal escalation, whistleblowing, or departure. These decisions carry their own complexity that goes beyond the scope of this book. The regulated leader, creating emotional safety for others. Leadership deserves its own extended discussion in this chapter, because the leadership role creates specific and important dynamics with respect to emotional reactivity. Leaders are unusually visible, their emotional states are unusually influential, and the consequences of their reactive behavior extend beyond the immediate interpersonal situation to the entire team, department, or organization they led. The research on emotional contagion demonstrates that emotions are literally contagious between people, transmitted through physiological co-regulation, through the observation and unconscious mirroring of facial expressions and body language, and through the interpretive frameworks that leaders create about what is safe, what is valued, and what is expected. In a group or team context, the emotional tone of the leader spreads throughout the group with remarkable efficiency. A reactive leader creates a reactive culture. A regulated leader creates a regulated culture. The reactive leader's impact on their team is characterized by several specific and destructive patterns. Their team members spend significant cognitive energy monitoring the leader's mood and managing their own behavior in response to it. This monitoring consumes cognitive resources that would otherwise be available for the actual work. Team members become reluctant to raise problems, disagree, or offer negative feedback, because they have learned that the reactive leader receives these inputs with defensiveness or anger. The team's information environment deteriorates, and the best team members, those with the skills and the self-respect to choose their environments, leave. The talent that remains is self-selected for either tolerance of reactive environments or inability to find alternatives. The regulated leader's impact is characterized by precisely opposite patterns. Team members feel safe bringing full information, including bad news, because they have experienced that the regulated leader can receive hard information without shooting the messenger. Disagreement is possible because the regulated leader does not experience challenge as a personal attack. Problem solving improves because the team can think clearly rather than monitoring emotional hazards. And the people who most want to contribute, who most need psychological safety to bring their best, are most attracted to and most retained by the regulated leader's environment. For those in leadership roles, the responding rather than reacting work is therefore not only a personal development project. It is an organizational development project. The change in your emotional regulation has direct consequences for the performance, the well-being, and the development of every person in your sphere of leadership. This is not pressure to be perfect. It is recognition that the work matters in ways that extend well beyond your own experience. Specific professional situations and how to respond. Several specific professional situations come up consistently in discussions of responding rather than reacting, and it is worth addressing them directly with specific response frameworks. The first is the situation of being publicly criticized or humiliated, whether by a manager in front of the team, by a client in a meeting, or by a peer in a group discussion. The reactive response typically involves some combination of visible emotional distress, defensive counter-argument, or complete shutdown. All of these responses both fail to address the underlying issue and communicate exactly the opposite of the professional composure that the situation calls for. The responding framework for public criticism involves several specific moves. First, the immediate internal pause, a breath, a settling, to prevent the most visible expressions of the reactive response. Second, a composed, brief acknowledgement that demonstrates you have heard the concern without either accepting or rejecting it in the moment. Thank you, I want to give that the consideration it deserves. Third, if the criticism contains something valid, a later and more private follow-up that addresses it genuinely. Fourth, if it does not contain validity, a clear, non-defensive response, either in the moment or in a subsequent conversation, that offers your assessment of the situation calmly and without escalation. The second specific situation is the experience of being passed over for a promotion, opportunity, or recognition that you believe you deserved. This situation typically activates a complex mix of fairness triggers, competence triggers, and, depending on who received what you did not, comparison and inadequacy triggers. The reactive responses include visible bitterness, withdrawal of engagement, passive-aggressive behavior toward the person who received the opportunity, and escalation to management in a manner that is driven more by the emotional activation than by a genuine strategic assessment. The responding framework here begins with the pause taken before any action. Before sending the email, before scheduling the conversation, before expressing any reaction to colleagues, pause. Regulate. Identify what you are actually feeling. Is it primarily hurt, anger, fear about your standing, shame? Each of these has a different response implication. Then, from a regulated state, engage with the genuine question. What information, if any, would be valuable to seek from the person who made this decision? What might I learn from this that would serve my development? And what, if anything, do I want to communicate, and in what spirit? Chapter 8. Responding to yourself. Self-compassion is the deepest foundation. Of all the forms of responding that this book addresses, perhaps the most important and the most consistently neglected is responding to yourself. Most people who struggle with reactive patterns also maintain a profoundly reactive relationship with their own inner experience. They are harsh with themselves. They are critical and judgmental about their own emotions, their own mistakes, their own limitations. They apply to themselves the same driven, automatic reactivity that they apply to the outer world. And this internal reactivity is not incidental to the broader pattern of reactivity. It is foundational to it. When you are in a chronic internal state of self-criticism, self-judgment, and self-punishment, your nervous system is chronically activated. The internal critic does not feel different to your amygdala from an external critic. Both are perceived as threats. Both trigger the stress response. Both maintain the nervous system in a state of activation that lowers the threshold for all other triggers. The harsh internal relationship is a constant, pervasive source of nervous system activation that makes you continuously more reactive to everything else in your environment. Conversely, developing genuine self-compassion, the capacity to treat your own experience with the same warmth, understanding, and patience that you would offer a dear friend in the same situation, is one of the most powerful changes you can make for your overall emotional regulation. It directly reduces the constant background activation that makes you more reactive. It builds the emotional resilience that allows you to face difficult situations without being overwhelmed. And it creates the internal safety from which genuine, sustained change becomes possible. The research on self-compassion, what the science shows. The scientific study of self-compassion has grown enormously over the past 2 decades, led primarily by the psychologist Kristin Neff, whose work has produced a substantial body of empirical research on the effects of self-compassion on well-being, motivation, resilience, and emotional health. The findings are consistent and compelling, and they consistently challenge the cultural assumption that self-criticism is necessary for high performance and growth. The research demonstrates that higher self-compassion is associated with significantly lower levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. It is associated with greater emotional resilience, defined as the capacity to recover more quickly and more completely from difficult experiences. It is associated with more growth motivation after failure, not less. People who are higher in self-compassion are more likely to acknowledge their mistakes honestly, more willing to take responsibility for them, and more motivated to improve, because they are not spending their energy on self-defense and self-protection. Self-compassion is also associated with significantly better emotional regulation in the specific sense relevant to this book. Higher self-compassion predicts less reactivity to negative events, greater capacity to sit with difficult emotions without reacting to escape them, and more measured, considered behavioral responses to challenging situations. People who can treat themselves with warmth and understanding when they are struggling simply behave better, in the sense of more deliberately and more values-aligned, than people who respond to their own struggles with harsh self-criticism. Perhaps most surprisingly to many people, the research consistently shows that self-compassion is not associated with reduced standards or reduced accountability. Self-compassionate people do not let themselves off the hook. They are not less self-aware or less honest about their limitations. In many studies, they demonstrate more honesty about their failures than people who are less self-compassionate, precisely because they do not feel that honest self-assessment threatens their fundamental worth. They can afford to see themselves clearly because they know that what they see does not determine whether they deserve care and respect. The 3 components of self-compassion. Kristin Neff's model identifies 3 components of self-compassion that together constitute the full practice. Understanding each component gives you a specific and practical framework for developing self-compassion in your own experience. The first component is self-kindness, which is defined as the active practice of treating yourself with warmth and understanding when you are struggling, failing, or feeling inadequate, rather than treating yourself with harsh judgment and self-criticism. Self-kindness is not telling yourself that everything is fine when it is not. It is not minimizing your genuine errors or your genuine limitations. It is the recognition that struggling is difficult and deserves the same care that you would offer another person who was struggling in the same way. Self-kindness in practice might sound like, "This is really hard right now. It makes sense that I am struggling with this. What do I need?" It involves the specific use of warm, understanding language in your internal dialogue rather than the critical, contemptuous language of the internal critic. It involves a tone in your relationship with yourself that you can recognize as genuinely kind, not as performative niceness, but as the actual warmth that you would bring to a person you deeply love who was in the same situation. The second component is common humanity, which is the recognition that suffering, failure, and imperfection are not personal abnormalities but universal features of human experience. When you are reactive, when you fail, when you struggle, the experience often feels uniquely shameful. Everyone else seems to have it more together, to handle things more gracefully, to not be subject to the reactive patterns that feel so obviously wrong in yourself. This sense of isolation in suffering amplifies the pain and makes the self-criticism feel more justified. Common humanity directly challenges this sense of isolation. Your reactive patterns are not aberrations. They are expressions of the same nervous system architecture, the same evolutionary history, and the same vulnerability to early experience that characterize every human being on the planet. Every person who has ever lived has reacted when they wished they had responded. Every person who has ever loved has said something hurtful in anger. Every person who has ever been ambitious has suffered the sting of failure. You are not uniquely broken. You are deeply human. The third component is mindfulness, which in the context of self-compassion means holding your painful experiences in balanced, non-judgmental awareness rather than either over-identifying with them or suppressing them. Mindfulness in self-compassion is the capacity to acknowledge that you are suffering, that the suffering is real, without either drowning in it or pushing it away. It is the capacity to be honest about your pain without making it the whole story of who you are. This mindfulness component is the bridge between self-compassion and the emotional literacy and tolerance work described in Chapter 5. Both are asking you to be present with your difficult experience without being overwhelmed by it, and to bring to that presence a quality of openness and non-judgment that allows the experience to be felt and processed rather than fought or suppressed. The internal critic. Understanding its origins and its function. To work effectively with the internal critic, you need to understand where it came from and what it was originally trying to do. The internal critic did not arise from nowhere. It was formed through your experience, typically in childhood, of being in an environment where evaluation was frequent, where approval was conditional, and where criticism was the primary mechanism through which behavior was shaped. Children who grow up in environments characterized by significant criticism, by conditional love, or by the implicit message that they must earn their acceptance by being a certain way, internalize the critical voice of the environment as their own internal voice. The internal critic is doing what it was originally designed to do in that environment, keeping you in line, keeping you from making the mistakes that invited disapproval, keeping you safe from the judgment of others by judging yourself first and most harshly. In the context of the original environment, this was a form of adaptive intelligence. It worked, in the sense of reducing disapproval by anticipating and preempting it. But the internal critic has not updated to reflect your current environment. It continues to operate with the urgency, the harshness, and the unforgiving standards of that original context, regardless of how different your current situation is. The critic that was adapted to the childhood home of a harsh, conditional parent continues to function in the adult workplace, the adult relationship, the adult experience of failure, as though the stakes were the same, as though the disapproval of the internal critic were still as dangerous as the disapproval of the parent once was. Understanding this history does not make the internal critic go away, but it does make it possible to recognize the critic for what it is, not the voice of truth, not an accurate assessment of your worth, but the echo of a past environment that was genuinely difficult to navigate. This recognition creates the distance from the critic that makes a different, more compassionate response possible. Responding to the internal critic, a practical framework. Working with the internal critic from the perspective of this book involves applying the same fundamental shift that we are applying to external reactive patterns, from automatic reaction to conscious response. You cannot silence the internal critic by deciding to silence it, any more than you can silence the amygdala by deciding to not be triggered. But you can develop the capacity to observe the critic without being run by it, and to offer a different, more compassionate response to the same content. When you notice the internal critic activated, the practice begins with observation, simply noticing that the critic is speaking, and naming it with some gentleness and some distance. There is the internal critic again, or, I notice I am being very hard on myself right now, creates the basic observational space that prevents complete identification with the critic's voice. The second step is identifying the underlying emotion. The internal critic is typically expressing pain or fear through the language of judgment and criticism. I am so stupid is typically expressing shame or fear of inadequacy. I can never do anything right is typically expressing grief or exhaustion. Why did I say that? I always mess things up is typically expressing a complex of shame, regret, and fear of how the situation will unfold. Finding the actual feeling underneath the critic's words is more honest and more useful than engaging with the critic's claims as though they were literal truths. The third step is the self-compassionate response. From the perspective of the self-compassion practices described above, you offer the actual feeling that you have found underneath the critic's words, the kind of response you would offer a good friend expressing the same pain. Not dismissal, not toxic positivity, not telling yourself that it does not matter when it does, but genuine warmth and genuine recognition. Of course I am feeling this way. This situation is genuinely difficult. I am doing the best I can with the capacities I have at this point in my development. What do I need right now? What would actually help? This practice is not quick and it is not comfortable in the beginning. The internal critic often responds to self-compassionate responses with a counterattack. If you are kind to yourself, you are letting yourself off the hook. You are lowering your standards, you are being indulgent, you do not deserve kindness right now. These counterattacks are themselves the critic's responses to the perceived threat of being undermined. They are not truth. They are the critic defending its position. With persistent practice, the counterattacks diminish as the self-compassionate response becomes more established. Self-compassion after reactive episodes. The most important and most challenging context for the self-compassion practice, in the specific work of this book, is the period immediately following a significant reactive episode. This is when the internal critic tends to be at its most vicious and most consuming. The reactive episode has provided the critic with evidence. You did react, you did say the damaging thing, you did fail to be the person you want to be. And the critic may use this evidence to construct a case against your fundamental adequacy as a human being, or as a partner, or as a parent, or as a professional. The self-compassionate response to this period requires a specific combination of honesty and warmth that is genuinely difficult to hold simultaneously. The honesty. Yes, I reacted. The reaction was real and it affected people and there are things I need to attend to. The warmth. I am a person who is working to change deeply ingrained patterns that were shaped by significant developmental experience, and this work is genuinely hard, and setbacks in hard work do not make me fundamentally bad. This combination, honesty and warmth held together, is what prevents the self-compassionate response from sliding into self-indulgence on one side or self-punishment on the other. It is the foundation from which genuine accountability becomes possible. When you are not drowning in shame after a reactive episode, you have the psychological space to look honestly at what happened, to genuinely understand your contribution to it, to make genuine repair, and to extract the learning that will help you respond better next time. None of those things are possible when the internal critic has consumed all your psychological resources in self-condemnation. Chapter 9. Rebuilding after a reaction. What to do when you blow it. You are going to blow it. Let us begin this chapter with that honesty. You are going to have reactive episodes. Probably many of them, over the course of your life, and especially in the period immediately following your engagement with this work, when your self-awareness has increased faster than your regulatory capacity. You are going to say the thing you immediately regret. You are going to shut down when you needed to stay open. You are going to escalate when you needed to de-escalate. This is not a prediction of failure. It is a recognition of what it means to be a human being in the process of changing deeply ingrained patterns. What distinguishes the person who is genuinely developing from the person who is stuck is not whether they have reactive episodes. It is what they do with those episodes when they occur. The person who is genuinely developing uses every reaction as data, as an opportunity for self-knowledge, for repair, for learning, and for the adjustment of their practice. The person who is stuck treats every reaction as evidence that change is impossible, uses it as ammunition for the internal critic, and moves on without extracting the value that even the most damaging episode can provide. This chapter provides a complete framework for what to do when you blow it. It covers the stabilization work of the immediate aftermath, the honest review that converts the episode from a loss into information, the repair work that addresses the impact on others, and the learning extraction that prevents recurrence. Stage 1. Stabilization, getting regulated before doing anything. The first and most essential stage in the recovery from a reactive episode is stabilization. Getting yourself to a sufficiently regulated state that you can think clearly, see honestly, and engage productively with the aftermath. Before reviewing what happened, before attempting repair, before talking to anyone about what occurred, you need to regulate. This may seem obvious, but it is violated constantly. The shame and distress of the immediate aftermath of a significant reactive episode create enormous pressure to do something, to apologize, to explain, to justify, to make it right, to address the consequences. But if you are still significantly activated when you attempt these things, you will do them poorly. The apology will be tinged with defensiveness. The explanation will slide into rationalization. The attempt to make it right will feel to the other person like an attempt to manage your own discomfort rather than genuine accountability. Stabilization involves all of the physiological regulation tools described in the pause chapter. Slow breathing, physical movement if possible, body awareness, grounding. It also involves time. genuinely giving your nervous system the 20 to 30 minutes it needs to clear the acute hormonal activation of the amygdala hijack. And it involves deliberate refusal to engage with the reactive narrative during this time. Not rehearsing the argument, not constructing the explanation, not reviewing the evidence for why you were right. Simply stabilizing. One practical challenge of the stabilization stage is that the person you have reacted toward may be wanting resolution more quickly than stabilization allows. If this is the case, brief, honest communication buys the necessary time. I need a little time to collect myself before we continue. I am not disappearing. I will come back to this. This communication is itself a form of response rather than reaction. You are making a deliberate choice, communicating it clearly and honestly, and maintaining genuine commitment to resolution even while creating the space for regulation. Stage 2. Honest review, looking clearly at what happened. From a stabilized state, the next stage is honest review, a clear, honest, compassionate examination of what happened, from trigger to aftermath. The purpose of this review is not self-punishment. It is understanding. You are building the self-knowledge that will make this specific type of reactive episode less likely in the future. The honest review is best conducted in writing, using the reaction journal structure introduced in Chapter 3. Written review requires and produces more precision than mental review, and the written record is available for the kind of pattern analysis that reveals your reactive landscape most clearly. The review covers the complete sequence of the episode. The trigger. What specifically activated your amygdala? Be as precise as possible. Not what they said, in general, but the specific word, tone, or behavior that served as the match. The physiological response. What did you notice in your body, and at what point in the sequence? The emotional content. What were you actually feeling, including both the primary and secondary emotions? The narrative. What story did your mind construct about what was happening? The behavior. What specifically did you do? The consequences. What were the immediate and somewhat longer-term effects of your behavior on others and on the situation? The honest review also includes a reflection on the intervention points. Where in the sequence was the pause potentially accessible, and what prevented you from accessing it? Was the trigger so rapid and the activation so intense that you were fully hijacked before any pause was possible? Or was there a moment, however brief, where you sensed the activation rising and chose not to pause? Both of these experiences provide different and valuable information. The first suggests that your detection of early activation needs more development. The second suggests that your motivation to use the pause tools in that specific context needs more support. Stage 3. Impact assessment, understanding what you did to others. The impact assessment stage is separate from the honest review of your own internal experience, and it is important to keep it separate. The honest review is about understanding what was happening in you. The impact assessment is about understanding what your behavior did to others. These are distinct inquiries, and conflating them typically distorts both. Impact assessment requires genuine curiosity about the other person's experience. This is harder than it sounds, because the same amygdala activation that produced the reactive behavior has also produced a reactive narrative that tends to explain and justify the behavior, which in turn tends to minimize the impact on others. The narrative says, they provoked it, it wasn't that bad, they are making too much of it, they need to take some responsibility for their role in what happened. All of these may contain some truth, but they are not a complete or accurate account of the impact of your reactive behavior on the other person. The most honest and most effective impact assessment involves asking the other person, directly and genuinely, how they experienced your reactive behavior. Not immediately and not while you are still activated. But once you are stabilized and the other person is in a sufficient state to engage, the question is direct. I know I reacted badly. I want to understand how that affected you, if you are willing to tell me. And then you listen. You listen without explaining, without defending, without contextualizing. You just listen and receive. This listening is one of the most demanding things in this chapter, because what you hear may be painful, may activate your own feelings of shame or guilt, may trigger the desire to explain or defend. But genuine listening to the impact of your behavior on others is the foundation of genuine repair. You cannot repair damage you have not genuinely acknowledged. And you cannot genuinely acknowledge damage you have not genuinely heard. Stage 4. Genuine repair, making it right. Repair is the outward-facing work of the recovery sequence. what you do to address the impact of your reactive behavior on others. The goal of repair is not to eliminate the discomfort of guilt by obtaining the other person's reassurance. The goal is to genuinely address the impact of your behavior and to demonstrate, through specific words and subsequent behavior, that you understand what happened and that you are committed to doing things differently. A genuine and complete repair conversation has a specific structure. The first element is direct, specific acknowledgement of the reactive behavior, naming exactly what you did, without euphemism and without minimizing. Not, "I know I wasn't at my best," but, "I raised my voice, and I said things that were hurtful and unfair." Not, "I kind of shut down," but, "I stonewalled for 2 days and I know that must have felt like abandonment." The second element is accountability without rationalization. "That is not how I want to behave in this relationship, and I take full responsibility for it." Notice what is absent from this statement: any explanation of what triggered the reactive behavior. The explanation may be relevant, and there may be an appropriate moment for it, but that moment is not in the first breath of the accountability statement. When explanation precedes accountability, it is experienced as justification, not understanding. When accountability comes first, cleanly and without qualification, the subsequent context can be heard as genuine information rather than as excuse. The third element is genuine curiosity about impact. "I want to understand how that affected you. Can you tell me?" And then the genuine listening described above. This element requires the emotional courage to hear something painful without defending against it. The fourth element, optional but often valuable, is some expression of what you intend to do differently, not as a promise of perfection, but as a genuine, modest commitment that comes from your best self. "I am working on pausing before I react like that. I am not going to pretend it will never happen again, but it matters to me to do better and I am committed to that work." The fifth element of genuine repair is the most important and the most often neglected: the subsequent behavior that demonstrates that the repair was genuine. Words in a repair conversation are easy to produce. What demonstrates their genuineness is whether your behavior in subsequent similar situations reflects the learning you expressed in the repair. If you apologized for explosive behavior and exploded again in a very similar situation within weeks, the repair was incomplete. Not because you were a bad person, but because the work of genuine change had not yet been done. Genuine repair, in the deepest sense, is demonstrated over time through change behavior, not in a single conversation. Stage 5. Learning extraction, converting loss into progress. The final stage of the recovery sequence is the stage that determines whether the reactive episode is purely a cost or becomes an investment in genuine development. Learning extraction is the deliberate, structured process of pulling from the reactive episode everything that it can teach you about your patterns, your triggers, your intervention points, and your practice. The learning extraction stage is best done after sufficient time has passed that you are fully stabilized and can look at the episode with genuine curiosity rather than with the shame or defensiveness of the immediate aftermath. A day or two after the episode is typically an appropriate interval. You are close enough to remember the details clearly and far enough to look at them with some equanimity. The learning extraction involves several specific questions. What specific trigger activated this reaction? Is this a trigger you have mapped before? If so, what does this episode add to your understanding of it? If not, what does it tell you about a pattern you had not previously identified? Where in the sequence was regulation potentially accessible, and what, if anything, prevented you from accessing it? What practice, specifically, might help you access regulation earlier in this sequence next time? What understanding about your own history or your own emotional patterns does this episode deepen? The answers to these questions, recorded in the reaction journal, gradually build a body of self-knowledge that is genuinely transformative. Over months and years of this practice, the patterns become unmistakably clear. The triggers become predictable. The points where your pause is most and least accessible become mapped with precision. And the specific practices that most help in your most challenging trigger situations become identified through actual experience rather than through theoretical understanding. This is the promise of the aftermath, reviewed with honesty and compassion. Not that the episode was good, or that the damage was acceptable, or that the suffering caused to others was worth it. But that even the worst reactive episodes, when worked with skillfully, can contribute to the development that makes future similar episodes less likely and less damaging. Nothing is wasted in the responding rather than reacting project. Everything can be learned from. Chapter 10. The Responding Life, Building Permanent and Lasting Change. Everything in this book has been preparation for this chapter. The neuroscience in Chapter 1, the anatomy of reaction in Chapter 2, the trigger mapping in Chapter 3, the pause in Chapter 4, the emotional literacy in Chapter 5, the specific contexts of relationship, work, and self-compassion in Chapters 6 through 8, and the recovery work in Chapter 9. All of it has been preparation for the question that this final chapter addresses. How do you make this permanent? How do you move from occasional successful pauses, from progress that feels real but fragile, from insight that illuminates but does not yet transform, to a genuinely and lastingly different way of moving through the world? How do you build not just a set of skills but a character? This is the question of identity level change. And it is the most important question in this book, because without it, the preceding chapters describe a set of interesting concepts and useful techniques that will improve your life temporarily but not transform it fundamentally. The difference between temporary improvement and fundamental transformation lies in whether the work reaches the level of identity, whether who you understand yourself to be, at the deepest level, changes. This chapter addresses the specific requirements of identity level change, the formal practices that build the neural infrastructure, the environmental conditions that support regulated behavior, the relational contexts that facilitate development, and the specific identity narrative shift that converts occasional responding into a fundamental way of being. Why lasting change requires more than understanding. One of the most common and most painful experiences in personal development is what we might call the understanding gap. The gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it consistently in the situations that matter most. You understand the neuroscience. You can describe the anatomy of a reaction in detail. You know your triggers. You can articulate the pause and its rationale with precision. And then you are in the triggered situation, and the understanding disappears, and the reaction happens, and you find yourself in the aftermath again. This experience is demoralizing enough to cause many people to abandon the work. If understanding is not sufficient, they reason, perhaps the change is not possible for them. Perhaps they are simply too reactive, too deeply conditioned, too thoroughly patterned to change. This reasoning is both understandable and wrong. Understanding is necessary but not sufficient for lasting change because the reactive patterns that you are working to change are not stored in the parts of your brain that process propositional knowledge. They are stored in the procedural memory systems, the same systems that store how to ride a bicycle or how to type without looking at the keyboard, and in the emotional memory systems of the amygdala. These systems do not update through intellectual understanding. They update through repeated emotional experience, through the repeated doing of the new thing in the actual situations that matter, through what neuroscientists call experiential learning. This is why the formal practices described throughout this book, meditation, journaling, body scan, the specific techniques of the pause, must actually be practiced, not just understood. Reading about meditation is not the same as meditating. Understanding the logic of the pause is not the same as having paused 1,000 times in triggered situations and built the neural habit of pausing. Understanding emotional literacy is not the same as having practiced naming your emotions daily for a year and developed the automatic precision of granular emotional identification. Lasting change requires what we might call the embodiment of understanding, the translation of what you know into what you do, so consistently and so repeatedly that it becomes what you are. That translation is the work of this chapter. The architecture of lasting change, 3 levels. Lasting behavioral change operates at 3 levels simultaneously. Genuine, permanent change requires attention to all 3. Because change that occurs at only 1 or 2 levels tends to be fragile and prone to regression under significant stress. The first level is neural, the actual rewiring of the brain's reactive pathways and the strengthening of the response pathways. This is the biological substrate of lasting change, and it happens through exactly the mechanism described in Chapter 1, neuroplasticity driven by repeated experience. The formal practices, daily meditation, consistent journaling, body awareness development, are the primary tools for this neural level of change. They must be practiced consistently over months and years to produce the measurable neurological changes that make lasting behavioral change possible. The second level is environmental, the deliberate design of the conditions in which you live and work to support regulated behavior and to minimize unnecessary triggering. This includes your physical environment, your relational environment, your digital information environment, and your daily rhythms of activation and rest. Environmental design is often underappreciated as a variable in lasting behavioral change, because it feels less dramatic than the psychological work. But the research on habit change consistently shows that environmental factors are among the most powerful determinants of whether new behaviors are maintained or abandoned. The third level is identity, the narrative you carry about who you are and what you are capable of. Identity level change is the deepest and most durable form of change, because your identity story influences everything else. What you notice, what you practice, how you interpret your experiences, what you believe about what is possible. When your identity shifts from, "I am a reactive person," to, "I am a person who is building the capacity to respond deliberately," the entire emotional and behavioral landscape of your life shifts with it. The daily practice architecture. What to do every day. Lasting change requires a daily practice architecture, a set of regular practices, embedded in your daily life, that consistently build the neural infrastructure of response and maintain the self-awareness that makes deliberate choice possible. This architecture does not need to be elaborate or time-consuming. The practices that matter most can be conducted in 20 to 40 minutes per day. But they do need to be consistent, because the brain changes through repetition over time, not through intensity in isolated moments. The first and most important daily practice is formal mindfulness meditation. The specific form of meditation matters less than the consistency of the practice. A simple breath awareness practice, a loving kindness practice, a body scan practice, all of these, practiced daily, produce the neurological changes associated with improved emotional regulation. The target for a stable, effective practice is 20 minutes daily. If you are beginning, 10 minutes is a productive starting point. The quality of the attention brought to the practice matters more than the quantity of time. The second daily practice is the morning check-in. Before leaving the house, before opening devices, before engaging with the demands of the day, take 5 minutes to check in with yourself. 3 questions. What am I feeling right now, as specifically as I can identify? Is there anything carried over from yesterday or from the week that is still active in my nervous system and that I should be aware of? And what values do I want to bring to this day, specifically in the situations I can anticipate being difficult? The third daily practice is the evening reflection. A brief review of the day's emotional landscape. Were there moments of genuine response? What made them possible, and how can I build on them? Were there reactions? What triggered them? What can I learn, and what adjustment to my practice does this suggest? This is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is the application of the scientific method to your own development, hypothesis, experiment, observation, adjustment. The fourth practice, not daily but consistent, is the reaction journal. After any significant reactive episode, within 24 hours if possible, the structured review described in Chapter 9. This practice is the primary engine of self-knowledge development, and it is the practice that most directly converts reactive episodes from pure costs into investments in development. Environmental design for regulated living. The environments you inhabit either support or undermine your capacity for regulated behavior. And designing those environments deliberately, to support the responding rather than reacting orientation, is one of the most practical and most underused strategies for lasting change. Physical environment design involves creating spaces that support regulation. Home environments that have areas of quiet and calm, that are not perpetually chaotic and stimulating, that allow for the kind of restorative rest that prevents the chronic fatigue that dramatically increases reactivity. Workplace environments, to whatever degree you can influence them, that are not designed to maximize chronic low-level threat activation through constant interruption, constant performance monitoring, and constant cognitive overload. Digital environment design is particularly important in the contemporary context. The ubiquity of devices and the design of digital platforms around the maximization of engagement, which in practice means the maximization of emotional arousal and often the maximization of threat activation, means that many people are maintaining their nervous systems in a state of chronic low-level activation simply through their normal digital habits. Deliberate digital environment design might include specific phone-free periods, particularly in the morning before the day's regulation practices are established and in the evening when the nervous system needs to deactivate for sleep. It might include curation of social media content to reduce the chronic exposure to threat-activating content. And it might include specific practices around email and messaging that prevent the constant context switching and constant low-level urgency that accumulate over a day into a significant burden on the nervous system's regulatory capacity. Relational environment design involves deliberate investment in the relationships and communities that support regulated behavior and regulated thinking, and deliberate management of the relationships and contexts that consistently and disproportionately trigger reactive patterns. This does not mean avoiding all difficult people or difficult conversations. It means being intentional about the ratio of nourishing to depleting relational contact, and ensuring that the nourishing relationships, the ones with people who model regulated behavior, who support your development, who provide genuine co-regulation, are receiving adequate investment. The identity shift. Becoming the person who responds. The deepest and most durable dimension of lasting change is the shift in your identity narrative, the story you carry about who you are and what you are capable of. Identity is not just a story you tell others. It is a story that shapes your behavior at every level, including below conscious awareness. Your identity narrative determines what you notice in your experience, how you interpret what you notice, what you believe is possible for you, and therefore what you attempt and what you avoid. The person whose identity narrative is, "I am a reactive person, I have a hot temper, this is just how I am," experiences every reactive episode as confirmation of this story. Every pause they successfully access is an anomaly, an exception that does not challenge the fundamental narrative. And the neural pathways of reaction are reinforced not just by the behavior but by the identity story that makes the behavior feel inevitable and defining. Changing the identity narrative is not a matter of positive affirmations or wishful thinking. It happens through the accumulation of genuine evidence, actual experiences of successful pausing and deliberate responding that, over time, become the data from which a new story is constructed. The first time you pause in a situation where you previously would have reacted, you have one data point. The 100th time, you have a pattern. The 1000th time, you have a fact about who you are. The identity shift that this pattern of evidence enables typically moves through a sequence of stages. In the first stage, the identity narrative is, "I am a reactive person trying to be less reactive." The identity is still fundamentally reactive. The work is experienced as working against the fundamental nature. In the second stage, the narrative shifts to, "I am a person who has reactive patterns that I am working with." The identity has decoupled from the reactive behavior. The work is experienced as developing something rather than fighting something. In the third stage, the narrative becomes, "I am a person who can respond rather than react in most situations, and who is continuing to develop this capacity." The responding has become the primary identity, with the remaining reactive patterns understood as areas for continued growth rather than as evidence of fundamental character. Each stage of this identity evolution requires its own evidence base, and that evidence comes only through the actual practice and the actual experiences of responding. The story follows the behavior. You cannot shift the identity narrative by deciding to see yourself differently. You can shift it by acting differently, consistently, in the actual situations that matter, until the new pattern has enough evidence behind it to constitute a genuine truth about who you are. The timeline of genuine change, an honest accounting. Genuine transformation of deep reactive patterns takes time. This is not discouraging news. It is honest news that allows you to approach the work with the patience and the long-term perspective that it requires, rather than expecting rapid, dramatic results and abandoning the work when those expectations are not met. In the first weeks and months of the practices described in this book, you will likely notice primarily increased awareness. You will catch your reactions earlier. You will understand their structure more clearly. You will identify your triggers with more precision. The reactions themselves may not diminish significantly in this period. Awareness precedes behavioral change. The development of awareness is not a failure to change. It is the essential prerequisite of change. In the first year of consistent practice, combining daily formal practice with consistent journaling and consistent application of the pause in daily situations, you will likely notice genuine behavioral change. You will have more successful pauses than you did before. Your reactions will be somewhat less frequent, somewhat less intense, and somewhat shorter in duration. You will repair more quickly and more genuinely. And you will experience the beginning of the identity shift, an emerging sense of yourself as someone who is genuinely developing, not just someone who has good intentions. Over several years of consistent practice, the change becomes more fundamental and more durable. The pause becomes increasingly automatic. The early detection of triggering, through body awareness and through the self-knowledge developed in the journaling practice, allows intervention at earlier and earlier stages of the reactive sequence. The emotional literacy becomes genuinely natural, providing real-time, precise information about your inner state in the most challenging situations. And the identity narrative has genuinely shifted. You no longer experience yourself primarily as a reactive person. You experience yourself as someone who responds with intention in most situations, who continues to develop in the challenging ones, and who is genuinely living from their values rather than their triggers. This is not a small thing. This is a profound thing. And it is worth the time, the effort, the imperfection, the setbacks, and the sustained commitment that it requires. Supporting your own change. The role of therapy and community. The practices described in this book are powerful and sufficient for many people to produce genuine, lasting change in their reactive patterns. But they are not the only tools available, and for many people, they are most effective when combined with additional support. Individual therapy, particularly therapy that is explicitly oriented toward emotional regulation, is one of the most powerful supports for this work. The therapeutic relationship itself provides something that no book can provide: the experience of being genuinely seen, heard, and accepted by another person in the full complexity of your emotional experience. This experience, consistently provided by a skilled therapist, produces exactly the kind of corrective emotional learning that updates the nervous system's threat detection patterns. The therapist who remains warm and present through your reactive moments, who is not destabilized by your reactivity, who does not withdraw or punish, is providing new relational data that gradually updates the amygdala's assessment of what to expect from emotional intimacy. Therapy is not a luxury. It is a technology, and for the work described in this book, it is a particularly powerful one. Community support is another important resource. Groups of people who are engaged in the same kind of inner work, meditation communities, therapy groups, peer support communities organized around emotional development, provide several things that individual practice cannot provide. They provide social accountability, which research shows significantly increases the consistency of practice. They provide the experience of witnessing others' struggles and growth, which normalizes the difficulty of the work and reduces the isolation and shame that can accompany setbacks. And they provide the kind of shared language and shared reference points that make sustained engagement with complex inner work more sustainable. Finally, the people closest to you, partners, close friends, family members who know you well, can be powerful allies in this work if they are enlisted as such, honestly and with appropriate vulnerability. Sharing with those closest to you that you are working on responding rather than reacting, that you may sometimes ask for patience or for a pause, that you will be working to repair more genuinely and more quickly when you do react. This kind of honest communication both enlists their support and models exactly the kind of vulnerable, non-defensive communication that the responding life requires. What you are building. A summary. As we approach the end of this chapter and this book, it is worth taking a moment to name clearly what you are building through all of this work. You are not building a personality transplant. You are not eliminating your emotional life or becoming a detached, invulnerable, always composed person who never reacts. That is not what responding rather than reacting is about, and it is not what emotional health looks like. You are building the capacity to feel everything, the full range of your human emotional experience, including the most intense and most uncomfortable feelings, and to choose your behavioral response to those feelings from your values rather than from your reactive patterns. You are building the space between stimulus and response in which your freedom and your growth actually live. You are building more genuine relationships, because genuine connection requires genuine presence, and genuine presence is only possible when you are not simultaneously managing your reactive defenses. You are building a professional life in which your actual capability can be expressed, rather than being constrained by the reactive patterns that emerge under pressure. You are building a relationship with yourself characterized by the kind of honest, compassionate self-knowledge that is the foundation for genuine development. You are building, over time, the identity of a person who responds. Not a perfect person, not a person who never struggles, but a person who, more and more consistently, brings their best to the situations that matter most. A person who, when they do react, knows what to do with that. A person who is genuinely, lastingly different from who they were when they began this work. That is what you are building. And it is worth everything it requires. Epilogue. The person you are becoming. We began this book with an honest acknowledgement that most people who pick up a book like this have experienced a moment of reckoning, a specific, painful moment in which the cost of reactive living became undeniable. Perhaps that moment is recent for you. Perhaps it happened long ago, and the search for something that could genuinely help has been ongoing. Perhaps it will happen after you read this book, when you apply what you have learned and discover both its power and its limits in your specific life. Wherever you are on that timeline, I want to say something directly. The fact that you are here, that you have read this far, that you have engaged honestly with what this book has been asking of you, is not nothing. It takes genuine courage to look clearly at your reactive patterns, to acknowledge the damage they have done, to commit to the sustained work of changing them. The courage is not in the dramatic gestures. It is in the daily 10 minutes of meditation when you would rather check your phone. It is in the pause held when every instinct in your nervous system is screaming to react. It is in the repair conversation made when it would be easier and more comfortable to let it go. It is in the honest reaction journal entry written when the self-knowledge that entry produces is uncomfortable. That courage accumulates. Each time you choose the pause over the reaction, you are not just managing a single episode. You are building a neural pathway, contributing one more repetition to the practice that gradually, reliably changes the brain. Each time you choose the repair over the rationalization, you are not just addressing a single relationship rupture. You are building the relational environment that makes further development possible. Each time you respond to yourself with compassion rather than with the internal critic's harshness, you are not just soothing a moment of distress. You are building the internal safety that is the foundation for genuine, lasting change. The person you are becoming through this work is not a different person. It is a fuller person, a more complete expression of who you already are at your best. The reactive patterns were never truly you. They were programming, installed by your history, running automatically in the absence of the pause that makes choice possible. The person who pauses, who feels with honesty and precision, who chooses from values rather than from fear, who repairs with genuine accountability, who maintains compassion for their own struggling humanity, that person is also you. They have been there all along, waiting for the space in which they could be expressed. The pause creates that space. The practices in this book build and deepen and extend that pause. And through the pause, more and more, the person you most want to be gets to show up. In your relationships, in your work, in your interior life, in the moments that matter most. Stop reacting. Start responding. Here is how. You are already on the way.